So hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to. So we're back with a brand new movie on What If Cursed Naruto Pregnanted Innocent Ten. But before we start, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Now let's begin the story. It was a dark evening, the moon just a sliver in the sky, and only a few lampposts installed this close to the docks. Tenten was glad for the darkness, as it allowed her to move about with more stealth than she was normally capable of. The soft soles of her slippers made nary a sound on the pavement, and her navy gown only made a slight rustle as she hurried along. She had to be quick, knowing that at any moment her father could enter her room and find her missing, and if she was not far away from him when that happened, a shudder passed through her as she imagined just how she would be punished. Thankfully, the docks were quiet, most workers having long since gone back to their homes. But there were still a few people milling about, and Tenten made sure she kept to the edges of the buildings, away from prying eyes. Her exit from her home had been hasty and ill-prepared. Oh, she had been planning on fleeing for a while, but she hadn't thought she would need to escape quite so soon, and therefore, hadn't gathered any of the items she had planned on bringing with her. Which meant, she would need to find a ship that was well stocked. Having no water or food meant she would be dependent on the ship she stowed away upon, something she hadn't wanted to happen. The more she moved about a ship, the more likely the chance of her getting caught. And for Tenten, the last thing she wanted was to be caught. Tenten had expected a few ships to be docked, the crew waiting until daylight before setting sail. To her dismay, though, only one sat proudly on the water, and Tenten tried not to allow her heart to sink at the sight. She had wanted a choice of which ship she would sneak aboard. She didn't want to find herself on a pirate ship or with other, unsavory people. But with only one ship here, the choice was made for her. Whatever horrors may await her on it, she knew they could be no worse than the ones she was running from. Taking a deep breath to calm her sudden nerves, Tenten snuck closer to the tall ship, her eyes straining to make out the flag. If she knew what she would be getting into, she would be better equipped to handle herself. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it out in the dark, or it was not flying at the moment. Either way, it told her nothing of the crew she would be hiding amongst, and she just had to hope she was making the right choice. No, she thought with a shake of her head, anything is better than that. When she was certain there were no people around, she scurried up the plank, her soft-soled shoes quiet against the wooden boards. Her heart thudded in her chest as she took her first step onto the ship. Her first step onto any ship. And she knew there would be no going back. She looked around, her petticoats in her hand as she crouched low to the ground, trying to blend in with the dark shadows around her as much as possible. She could make out a few men on patrol, and she knew she needed to move before she was spotted. Tenten's mind recalled a ship's basic schematics, something she had learned in preparation for this very purpose, and hoped this vessel wasn't any different. She quickly decided on what area of the ship she would hide in and hoped that it was situated in relatively the same position as the schematics. If not, there would be a high chance of her being caught, and that just wouldn't do. She refused to be handed back to her father, back to him. Captain Neji Hyuga sat at his desk, a lone candle casting a shadowy glow on the paper in front of him. He had read the letter multiple times already, the delicate penmanship a familiar and welcome sight to his tired soul. A frown pulled at his lips, and an irritated rumble echoed low in his throat. The trip would take at least 3 weeks, too long, in his opinion. He knew there was no quicker way of traveling than across the ocean, but he still longed to get there sooner. The precious cargo he kept on board for this trip would need to be protected at all costs, and his men knew what the consequences would be if any harm came to it. He had told his first mate that they would leave as soon as the first slivers of light touched the sky, but the more he thought about the trip, the more impatient he became. They could leave at any time, though he preferred sailing when the moon was brighter in the night sky. But time was of the essence, and he wanted them to be on their way as quickly as possible. Standing from his seat, he pulled open his cabin door and made his way to where he knew Lee would be. He no longer wished to wait until the sky lightened before leaving. As soon as his men were ready, they would unfurl the sails and depart the township. Neji was eager to get home. The smell of fermenting rum was strong this close to the barrels storing them, but Tenten refused to find another hiding spot. It had taken a lot of stealth to sneak past the men, pirates, she had realized with dismay after hearing them speak to one another, undetected and make her way down to the storeroom, and she wasn't going to risk getting caught leaving her place of hiding to look for another one, even if it was possible to find a less putrid-smelling one. She would just have to deal with the stench of rum, along with all the other smells that permeated the darkened room she was in. The storeroom, though used regularly, was the safest place Tenten could think of to hide during the trip. It was a large room, with stores of fresh fruit, vegetable, meats, and cheeses, as well as the multiple barrels of rum fermenting throughout the area. With this much space, she could easily find a dark corner towards the back of the room to spend her time, away from anyone who might wander in. It also meant that she wouldn't need to go looking for food, which was a bonus now that she had none of her own. Since she didn't know how long she would be out at sea before the ship docked next, she was grateful for the almost endless supply of food at her fingertips. Tenten was confident that she would be able to hear the footsteps of anyone who ventured inside, a good thing, because she knew she wouldn't be able to stay hidden for the duration of the trip without getting up and stretching. Despite the smell, Tenten was quite happy to stay in the storeroom until the ship docked, anything to make sure she didn't get captured by these pirates. Thoughts had come to mind of what they could do to her if found, but the worst outcome she could come up with was if they sent her back to her hometown. She would not let that happen. Tenten would rather die before going back there, and she was not against fighting tooth and nail to keep her newfound freedom. The pirates had recently set off, to go adventuring or looting or whatever the brigands did with their time out on the open sea. Tenten wanted nothing to do with them, and her heart hammered at the knowledge that she had stepped onto a ship full of lawless criminals instead of a merchant or naval ship, but time had been sensitive and they were her only chance of getting away. The room around her was spacious, and she longed to take her time exploring it, but not until she was certain she wouldn't be disturbed. Another few hours, until the pirates above were deep into their duties, and Tenten would leave her hiding spot and stretch her legs. And hopefully find some clothes to change into, something that was more appropriate for this type of situation. If she were to be caught, she wanted to look as much like a pirate as she could, to try and play herself off as one of the crew. For that to happen, she needed to find clothes suitable for a pirate. Shouting could be heard from above deck, no doubt the captain or his first mate giving the crew instructions. Since Tenten hadn't been able to see their flag, she had no idea whose ship she was on, but she hoped they weren't vicious. She had heard stories about some pirate crews being nothing more than simple animals, looting and killing every ship they happened upon. Tenten was a lone female on a ship filled with criminals. Not the most ideal place to be. But really, when she thought about it, she wasn't sure if it would be any worse than her previous situation. Besides, she wasn't planning on getting caught. But, of course, plans don't always go to, well, plan. Standing at the helm with Shikamaru, the sailing master, Neji watched his crew scuttle across the deck like ants, going about their duties in a professional and timely manner. He let the ghost of a smile grace his lips, knowing he had chosen a crew befitting the Crimson Knight. They were loyal to him and worked hard for their spoils. And Neji always made sure they had plenty of spoils to go around. "Captain," Shikamaru said from beside him, "it looks like it'll be smooth sailing for the foreseeable future. If it keeps up, we should arrive at Kirigakure in just under 3 weeks." Neji grunted in response, pleased. Clear skies met them as far as the eye could see, and a tailwind was behind them, pushing the Crimson Knight to go even faster. They were on a schedule, one he didn't want delayed, and he wouldn't tolerate anything that might get in the way of their destination. He also knew his crew had to remain vigilant. Kirigakure wasn't the safest island to get to, with some of the most violent pirates sailing its coastline. Not that Neji was worried about losing. He trusted his crew to remain level-headed during battles, and he trusted them to do their jobs efficiently and without remorse. But Neji didn't want to be caught off guard. The outcome of a battle often lay with who had more time to prepare, and those caught unawares did not usually make it out alive. The day was growing long, the sun creeping low in the sky and the first strips of pink dotting the horizon. The crew would change hands soon, so the ones now on duty could rest. He glanced up at Kiba, who was currently in the crow's nest, spyglass pressed to his eye as he surveyed the distance. He would be the first one to spot any signs of danger, but for most ships, the task became difficult after dark. Thankfully, as the name of his ship implied, that was when they struck best. His crew often snuck up on their enemies during nightfall, using the element of surprise to overwhelm their opponents and easily defeat them. They would loot the ship of all their valuables, not just treasure, but food, drink and anything else they desired to take, and leave the crew tied up. Neji wasn't the sort of captain to kill needlessly, but neither was he stupid enough to let those he plundered come back for him. Neji turned to leave, knowing he could trust Shikamaru to keep them on course. He still had a lot to do before they arrived at Kirigakure, and he needed to get a move on. He was already exhausted, and it was only day one of their travels. Neji would never show weakness in front of his crew, though, and he wasn't one to put off important tasks just because he was tired. He wouldn't go to bed until he was finished what he needed to get done. A weary sigh escaped Neji's lips as he made his way back to his quarters. It was going to be a long journey, 3 days. It had been 3 days since Tenten had stowed away on the pirate ship. The first day consisted of her trying her damnedest to not throw up, being unused to traveling by ship. She hadn't thought about seasickness in her plan to sneak aboard a vessel, and she refused to throw up since she didn't have anywhere safe to do so. The last thing she wanted was for someone to walk down into the storeroom and smell sick in the air. No, that couldn't happen. So, instead of letting go of her stomach's contents, Tenten used all her willpower to keep it down, doing whatever she could to distract herself from the feeling. Another thing she hadn't planned for was the lack of water she found. She had assumed there would be a large supply of water in some of the barrels, but each one she opened was filled to the brim with rum. Even though she had her fill to eat each day, even if it was just raw vegetables and dried beef, if she didn't drink some water soon, she would be in trouble. She could already feel herself getting weaker, and her head felt as though she had woken from a night of revelry, having drunk a barrel's worth of liquor. She had, in fact, tried drinking some of the rum in place of water, but that hadn't been the smartest thing to do. She had rarely consumed alcohol before, and she found that even the smallest amount of the potent drink left her lightheaded, and Tenten did not want to be found by pirates, drunk and not in control of her body. She was left cursing the pirates for not leaving water below deck for her. Where, if not in the storeroom, did they store the fresh water needed for the dozen or more crew members on this blasted ship? People had come and gone during the past few days, mainly the cook looking for more ingredients. Because it was the beginning of the trip, the fruits and vegetables brought on board, as well as the meat, were still in good condition, but after a week, she knew they would start wilting. The cook would have to stew the meat soon before it all went bad, unless they didn't mind eating off meat. Still, Tenten's mouth watered at the thought of biting into a nice piece of meat, instead of the dry rations she had found. But she couldn't complain, and she definitely couldn't try and sneak some cooked food for herself. No, that would be stupid. It didn't stop her from imagining, though, but even as she tried to come up with a plan, she knew nothing would work. Despite the clothes she was able to find, she still looked very much like a woman. She had tried to bind her breasts as best she could, but they still stuck out prominently. No hot-blooded man would believe for a second that she was an adolescent male. Leaving the storeroom during the day would be suicide, with all the footsteps she could hear coming from the deck. Even if she left her hideaway in the evening, with the shadows to conceal her on deck, she wouldn't be able to get past the crew members in closer quarters. No, she couldn't risk it. She sulked against the barrel of rum she leaned against, chewing on a dried stick of meat. Water for drinking wasn't the only thing she longed for. She hadn't had a bath in days, and she was starting to smell herself even over the top of all the rum. It was disgusting, but if she were to be caught, she hoped the sight and smell of her would ward off any disrespecting hands. The ship's rocking, which she had hated on the first day, began to lull her into sleep. She welcomed it, having not slept much the past couple days due to her constant worry about getting caught. Now though, she allowed it, knowing someone had just come down to the storeroom not long ago and that it would be empty of people for at least a few hours. A small nap wouldn't hurt anybody. She allowed sleep to pull her under, her mind wandering to what she would do once she made it to a new town. Neji's steps were silent as he walked down into the storeroom, the cook directly behind him. He had come to Neji earlier that day, complaining that his stores were being depleted quicker than usual. He suspected one of the men were stealing food, but Neji didn't believe that. His crew were fed well enough that they wouldn't risk his ire by attempting to steal food. Neji wondered if Choji was starting to lose his marbles, but as the captain of the ship, it was his duty to see firsthand what was disturbing the younger man. Choji was blabbering on about something, but Neji wasn't listening. He had more important things to do than this, and he was only going to have a quick walk around the storeroom before he told Choji he was imagining things. At first glance, Neji couldn't see anything out of place in the vast room, and he was on the verge of punishing his cook for wasting his time. But on closer inspection, he noticed something awry. At the far side of the storeroom, a barrel's lid lay askew, having not been refitted properly. All his men knew the importance of keeping the lids securely on the liquor barrels, both to preserve their taste and stop the risk of rats and other vermin falling in. He made sure to stay quiet as he walked towards the barrel, his footsteps light on the wooden floor beneath him. He held his hand out to still Choji, deciding that if there was something down here eating their food, besides rats, he would rather have the element of surprise on his side. For good measure, he unsheathed the sword attached to his belt, although he knew he need not. He was sufficient in hand-to-hand combat, and in this small space he wouldn't effectively be able to wield a sword, but it might scare them into inactivity if they tried to spring an attack on him. Neji didn't know what he was expecting to see, not really. One of his younger crew members, one of the new ones, had stolen into the storeroom, perhaps. If so, Neji would make sure they would never do so again. What he saw, however, stole his breath, and he blinked rapidly, sure he must be imagining things. Surely, this couldn't be happening. Neji eyed the sleeping figure in front of him, a frown tugging at his lips. What do we have here? Murmurs nudged Tenten awake, but she didn't quite understand the implication of the noise until she opened her eyes. Two men were staring down at her from where she was propped up against the barrel, leftovers of her latest meal strewn around the floor in front of her. One of the men looked shocked, like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, while the other man had a stern, almost angry expression on his face. Who the hell are you? The latter pirate asked, his voice full of authority. It was only then that Tenten noticed the sword in his grip and she had to fight the panic that threatened to overtake her. There was no point in freaking out. That would likely only get her killed. No, cool and calm was how she needed to play it. She made a show of yawning loudly, as though she belonged there and wasn't a stowaway. Sorry, I must have fallen asleep on duty, she said in a faux deep voice. I just came in here for a quick break. The angry pirate just frowned deeper, though one of his eyebrows lifted slightly at her words. Are you the one eating all our food? I mean, aren't we all eating our food? She shot back. It dawned on her belatedly that this man could be important. He didn't look like a shabby deckhand, that was for sure. His clothes looked finer than the grubby tattered outfits she imagined pirates wore. Maybe he was the first mate, or even. No, the captain wouldn't be down here, skulking around the storeroom for a potential thief. Surely not. Still, maybe she shouldn't give him so much lip. That eyebrow twitched again, so perfectly manicured for a pirate, and she was suddenly aware that this pirate was really quite handsome. His long, brown hair was so dark it bordered on black, and was tied with a ribbon at the base of his neck. His eyes were the color of lavender pearls. So light and mesmerizing she had to look away lest she become lost in them. I was not aware we were feeding a female on this vessel. He's a she? The other man asked, mouth open in surprise. Tenten felt a sliver of satisfaction knowing that her guys could, in fact, trick these pirates, some of them, at least. But that meant absolutely nothing now, not when this pirate so quickly ascertained who she was. A smirk tugged at his lips. Of course. She has no doubt tried to conceal this fact, but it is impossible to hide completely. Face turning fierce again, he gave her a quick, clinical once-over before holding her captive with his beautiful pale eyes. Who are you, and why are you on my ship? His ship? His ship? Tenten wanted to smack herself upside the head. He was the captain, after all. Why hadn't she remained vigilant? Instead, she had figured no one would be around, and she had been so tired she couldn't help but fall asleep. Now this pirate knew about her, worse, knew she was a woman. If she was lucky, he would kill her quickly. But if she had stumbled upon a vicious pirate ship? Tenten shuddered. She didn't want to think about what could be in store for her. Do not test my patience, woman. I will not ask again. The pirate captain had sheathed his sword, no doubt thinking she would be no match for him physically, and he would be right, and stood above her, imposing, with his arms crossed against his chest. I'm sorry, but I was just so hungry. I saw the food getting carted onto your ship and I acted without thinking. Before I knew it, you were pulling away from the shore and it was too late to leave. She was lying, but it was better this than telling the truth. There was no way she was going to give him more ammunition to attack her. From the way he continued to stare at her, eyeing her figure again, this time slower, she doubted he believed her lie. She didn't particularly look like a woman starving. Still, to her surprise he didn't press further. Instead, he reached down and roughly pulled her to her feet, making her head sway from the sudden rush of dizziness it brought about. She had been too long without water, and she could feel herself on the brink of passing out. Without speaking, he half pulled, half dragged her up the stairs and onto the open deck of the ship. Tenten had to shield her eyes from the sun, having spent so long in the dim storeroom, and she wasn't prepared for the effect the sudden heat had on her. Her head swam and she swayed in the pirate captain's grip. Unable to stop herself, Tenten fell limp and her eyes rolled to the back of her head as she passed out. Neji felt his captive grow limp in his hold. He thought it was a ploy of deception, but when he glanced at her, he saw the perspiration coating her brow, saw how her face had paled considerably during their short walk. She started to collapse, her feet no longer able to hold her up, but he caught her before she was able to take a nosedive to his deck. Lee was in front of him almost instantaneously, his bushy brows tugged down in confusion. Captain, who is this? A stowaway. The woman was tall but lean, and it didn't take much effort for Neji to lift her in his arms, wrinkling his nose at the smell that assaulted him. Do you want me to take her off your hands for you, Captain? Neji was about to shake his head no, but then wondered why he would do such a thing. He was the captain of a pirate ship. There was no need for him to bother himself with mangy stowaways that found themselves on his vessel. Take her to the brig, he told his first mate, passing her over to him. Do not make a big deal of it. I do not want the whole crew knowing there is a woman on board. You know how some of them get. Aye, Captain. Of course. Make sure there is water in her cell for when she wakes up. It does not seem as though she has had any since we left port. He wondered why she hadn't drunk any of the rum in the storeroom, then remembered the lid that had been askew. She must have tried it but decided against drinking it. A foolish decision, as she would not be dehydrated if she had let herself drink the grog. Water was a precious commodity on ships, and most of his crew drank alcohol instead. Aye. Food too? Lee asked while looking down into the face of the dirty female. Neji was tempted to say no, she had crept on board without their knowledge, after all, but he wasn't cruel, and definitely never to a lady. Yes, but just the bare minimum. Bread and a little soup will suffice for her. He may not be cruel, but he wasn't about to give her the best of their supplies either. Lee turned to do what his captain asked, but Neji stopped him with one more request. Notify me when she wakes up. I want to pay her a visit and find out the real reason she decided to come aboard the Crimson Knight. She didn't look like a commoner. Despite the dirt and grime, he could see the sheen of her hair and the healthy glow of her skin. Neji knew there must be a reason she was here. There was no way she had just stumbled aboard. Aye, Captain. With a nod, Lee left to do his bidding. With that settled, Neji turned and made his way to the helm, wanting to ascertain their current location. He wasn't about to allow himself to be distracted by a woman, no matter how pretty he imagined her to be under all that dirt. Tenten instantly felt the change of temperature upon awakening. Where she was warm in the storeroom, she could not stop shivering in this new location. After opening her eyes, she realized she had been moved to the brig, a revelation that angered Tenten more than frightened her. How dare the captain put her behind bars? She was a lady, a woman of station, and he had no right to show such disrespect to her person. Of course, she knew she did not look like a lady at the present moment. No, she looked more a person from the streets, not the wealthy young woman she was. Which was for the best. Tenten refused to give her real identity away to this man, no matter what he threatened to do to her. Telling him would equal death, not just her own, but his and his crew's as well. Not that Tenten should care one bit about what might happen to him or his crew members, but she did not want to be caught up in more of her father's, and his, mess than necessary. Tenten wondered if the captain would be willing to let her go once he reached his destination in exchange for her working on board. It would be preferable than being kept in this cold, damp cell, but even if she must remain here, as long as he promised to let her go once they reached land, she wouldn't complain. Hell, she even contemplated, albeit very briefly, warming his bed for the duration of their journey if that would persuade him to let her leave without harm. For surely by now her fiancé knew of her absence and was rallying his men to find her. Tenten would take her chances with these pirates over being handed back to that man. So no, she would not tell the captain who she was, and she would do everything in her power to leave this ship and make a new life at some unremarkable small town, somewhere her fiancé would never find her. Are you awake? The sudden voice startled Tenten and she jumped, her head whipping around to find the speaker. A man stepped into the dingy lamp light, holding a tray in his hands. The captain asked me to bring you some water, he said, letting himself into the cell and placing the tray in front of her with a kind smile. He also told me to get you some food. I am sorry, it is only basic. The captain would flog me if he found out I fed you anything other than what he told me to. Tenten didn't care. The piece of crusty bread and watered-down soup looked like heaven compared to the raw vegetables she had been eating for the last 3 days. If she wasn't in such a dire situation, she would be amused. Only a few days ago she had been excited for those vegetables, knowing she would have food to eat. How quickly she had come to loathe them. She would have loved some stew, or something with chunks of meat in it, but Tenten wouldn't complain. This was more than she had expected to receive from the pirate captain, and she would be an idiot to be ungrateful for it. Thank you. Tenten smiled at the kind pirate, wondering how such a man had found himself living this sort of life. My name is Rock Lee, but you may just call me Lee. I am the first mate to Captain Neji Hyuga of the Crimson Knight. He puffed out his chest with pride. He introduced himself, and Tenten couldn't help but feel amused, despite her circumstance. What is your name? Tenten had heard of the Crimson Knight. The crew were not as vicious as other pirates, but they were still ruthless, and they reveled in looting other ships, pirate or otherwise. Tenten supposed she was fortunate to have found herself onto a ship that took captives instead of killing all their enemies, and she had never heard of stories of the crew of the Crimson Knight raping people. But just because she had not heard the stories did not mean it never happened. Your name, miss? The first mate asked again, watching her with shrewd, guarded eyes. Tenten got the feeling that although he was kind to her, he was not one to be trifled with. I'm nobody, she replied. She grabbed the jug of water off the tray and took a huge gulp, not wanting to keep eye contact with the pirate. Although the water was slightly stale, she felt as though she could cry as it ran down her dry throat to settle in her belly. Nothing had ever tasted so nice. Even so, you must have a name. She shook her head. I do not want to say. If you are unwilling to say, I can only assume that you are a lady of means and you are afraid we will recognize the name and hold you for ransom. That, or you are running from someone and do not wish for us to spill your secrets to them. He spoke in an amused tone, as though he was just making it up, but Tenten knew he meant the words, and she had to stop herself from panicking at just how close to the truth he had come, on both counts. Does it matter what my name is? She snapped, using anger to hide her fear. You can only be planning to either kill me or let me go, and I don't see why my name is relevant in either case. If you want to kill me for stowing away on your ship, just do it. I'd rather not have my imminent death dragged out, and if you're planning on letting me go, then we won't see each other again, so what's so important about knowing it? Lee held her gaze for a long moment and Tenten had to fight not to squirm under his perusal. There was no way she was going to back down from this. As soon as they knew who she was they would attempt to benefit from that fact. She thought about lying, but this man seemed smart, smarter than perhaps he let on to others, and she wasn't a very good liar to begin with. It was best for her to just keep her mouth shut so as not to incriminate herself any further. Very well then. He stood up, gave her another long look, then nodded. Maybe you will feel more inclined to tell the captain. Tenten didn't think a sentence so innocuous could be said in such a threatening way, and she decided to re-evaluate the nice guy image she had in her head of him. Of course he wasn't a nice guy. He was a pirate for goodness sake. There was nothing nice about pirates. The first mate locked the cell behind him, taking with him the only lamp as he left and leaving her in complete and utter darkness. The brig smelled of unwashed bodies and musty clothes and was colder than most places on the ship. Neji walked down the stairs, lamp in hand, and couldn't help but wonder how his little prisoner was faring. The room was shrouded in darkness, Lee having said he took her light away to let her stew after refusing to tell him her name. It was a smart strategy, but one he knew the lady didn't deserve. Nevertheless, he was a pirate, and she no doubt expected him to use any means necessary to get what he wanted. Surely, after some time in the dark, cold and scared, she would have reflected on the futility of resistance. Stepping into the darkened room, Neji strained his eyes to see her, and could just make her form out in the cell closest to where he stood. He held the light aloft and moved closer. She was sitting with her legs against her chest and her head buried in her knees, and Neji wondered if she was crying. Are you well? He asked in what he hoped was a soft, placating voice. He did not know why he was trying to accommodate her. Maybe it was the fact that he hadn't spent much time in the presence of a woman of late, but he wanted her to feel, what, safe? Surely not, as she was aboard a pirate ship. Perhaps he wanted her to feel comfortable, at least with him. But again, he knew she would not. No doubt, her mind was conjuring up all sorts of horrors about what might happen to her now she was in his clutches. To Neji's surprise, when she lifted her head there were no traces of tears, nor did she look as though she had been in distress before he arrived. She glared at him heatedly and without an ounce of fear, and Neji felt both proud and angry that she should be so bold. If she were to have snuck upon any other pirate ship bar his, that defiance would get her flogged, or worse. Do I look well, pirate? She sneered, lip curling up in distaste. Indeed, she did not look well at all. From what he could see, her face was still covered in dirt and he could see her shivering from where he stood, the cold no doubt having seeped into her bones hours ago. If she were not careful, she could easily get sick, and if she got sick, there would not be much he could do for her. The ship's doctor, a name given very loosely to the quiet Shino, specialized in bullet and sword wounds, not on sickness. Even with injuries, Shino could not do much if infection occurred, and Neji had lost quite a few men over the years because their injuries had turned septic. No, I cannot say you do. Neji spied the food tray sitting beside her, empty of all contents, and he couldn't help but feel relieved. He told himself it was only because she was a lady and was supposed to be looked after, and he reminded himself to inform his first mate to bring her more water, so she could remain hydrated. His captive must have noticed the direction of his gaze, because she said, I suppose I should thank you for the food and drink, at the very least. Her voice was haughty, but he also heard the weariness she was trying to hide. Lee informed me that you were withholding your name. Why so? He thought he heard her mutter the word, snitch, under her breath, and he forced his lips not to tip up in amusement. She cocked her head to the side and regarded him a moment before giving him a smile that, despite the dirt and grime, made her breathtakingly beautiful. I apologize for my actions earlier. I was angry. My name is Beatrice, Beatrice Knight. Again, Neji felt a smirk tug at his lips. You are a terrible liar, lady. She shrugged, as though she already knew she would be found out. It was worth a shot. Why do you lie? His curiosity was running rampant. Who was this mysterious creature who had found her way onto his ship? Why does anyone lie, pirate? To hide the truth. And why would you wish to hide the truth? It is only a name, is it not? His captive rolled her eyes, and Neji remembered the color of them from when he had seen them up close in the storeroom. A warm, chocolate brown. They were so expressive, even in the dark room of the brig, and he wished to see them from a closer standpoint. I am sure you would recoil at the sound of my name. It is quite unremarkable. Hideous, even. This time, Neji couldn't stop the amused smile. I am sure it is no such thing. She was getting frustrated. Neji could tell. I don't know why you are so intent on knowing my name. It's nothing special. I'm nothing special. That, he replied, his voice dropping to a low murmur, is the biggest lie you have told yet. She rose quickly to her feet and took a step closer to him, hands on her hips. She glared at him. I will not tell you my name, so you may as well stop asking for it. She paused before asking, what do you plan on doing with me now that I'm stuck in here? She shivered, and Neji was not certain whether it was due to the cold or something she had thought of as she surveyed the cell around her. He could not answer that question, for he did not know the answer himself. She was an anomaly on his ship. He had not expected to have a woman aboard, and he wasn't certain what he should do now that she was here. To be sure, he knew exactly what he could get from her, but Neji was not that type of person. Even as a pirate, he still had a moral code. Instead of answering her question, he asked one of his own. Why did you sneak aboard my ship? That's a secret, she replied with a shake of her head. Another secret. Neji was further intrigued. His gaze traveled down her form, taking in dirtiness of her appearance. A plan came to mind. If you tell me your name, I shall grant you a bath. She couldn't disguise the longing look that entered her eyes at his words. He knew he had won. No woman would be able to resist the opportunity to bathe, especially one in such a state as she. To his surprise, though, her answer was not what he expected. As tempting as a bath sounds, I must decline. Very well. Neji made sure his tone didn't belay his surprise. A thought occurred to him, that he could withhold food from her until she told him her name, but he had the feeling that even then, she would not back down. Besides, Neji knew he would not be able to do such a thing, even if she did give him her name because of it. He would not be cruel to this woman. As he exited the brig, having left her with the lamp this time, his mind raced with who this mysterious woman could be. She must suspect he would recognize her name, and that in itself gave reason for pause. Only those that had power were known by more than a few people. He decided he would not give up until he found out the truth. Tenten was glad for the light, small though it was. It didn't give off any warmth, of course, but she was able to see again, and for that she was grateful. The cell that held her was filthy, and she had heard rodents scuttling about in the dark on more than one occasion already. The sound of them made her shudder in disgust, the thought of hundreds of small creatures feasting on her body springing to mind. She shook her head of the morbid thought. She had more important things to think of, namely, how to get out of here while keeping her identity intact. Despite the pirate captain having acted in a relatively decent manner, Tenten refused to be fooled. As soon as he knew who she was, he would write to her father and demand ransom for her release. Tenten would rather die than let that happen. In keeping her identity a secret, she was preserving her own life. She would not be swayed, no matter how handsome and charismatic she found the captain. Captain, the female captive said from her place on the floor. She was still wearing men's clothes, and it allowed her to move freely inside the cell, instead of being encumbered by so many layers. Still, Neji wouldn't mind seeing her in her usual attire. Clothes that would hug her body instead of sitting like a shapeless rag around her. My lady, he nodded in reply, coming to stand at the outside of her cell door. It had been a week since she was taken to the brig, and Neji had to admit that she was looking better than she had the day he found her. Not a lot cleaner. He had only allowed her some water and a rag to wash her face and hands, and she was yet to see a bath. But her face held color once more and she seemed brighter, more alert than when he had discovered her. Is it lunchtime yet? She asked, eyes darting behind him in case Lee was following with a tray of food. Neji wanted to snort at the gall of her. She was his prisoner. She would be fed when he deemed it appropriate. Hell, he had every right to withhold food from her since she was withholding information from him. Lee will bring something shortly, he replied instead, unable to deny her. Neji had been visiting his prisoner since the first day she had been transferred to the brig, and each day he looked forward to seeing her. She was a breath of fresh air on this testosterone-filled ship, and she didn't seem at all intimidated by him. More than once he found himself butting heads with her, but he found her wit and intelligence attractive. His captive smiled, and not for the first time Neji wondered what those lips would feel like against his. He quickly shook the thought away. That was not something he could allow himself to dwell on. And a bath too? Her eyes were twinkling as she spoke, but he detected the hopeful note in her voice. A smirk tugged at his lips. You get a bath when you tell me who you are. Water was precious on board ships, but he had promised her a bath if she told him her name, and he intended on honoring that promise. The fact that she refused to tell him meant she was afraid that he would recognize it, and that made him increasingly curious to know. She pouted, her shoulders slumping under the blanket he had provided for her on her first day in the brig, after he had noticed how her body shivered in the dark, damp room. I'm kind of hoping you get so sick of the stench of me that you have no choice but to order me to take a bath, she admitted with a sheepish grin. Neji raised an eyebrow at her. I was not aware that I had the ability to order you to do anything. She laughed at his words, the sound feminine and utterly enchanting. True. Not many people can get away with telling me what to do. Not for the first time, Neji felt the overwhelming desire to enter her cell, and had to tell himself why it would be a bad idea to do so. He wasn't worried she would attack him. He was worried about his own reaction to being so close to her, since he already felt attracted to the mysterious woman. Instead of caving into that desire, Neji pulled up a chair and sat by the door, knowing he would be there a while despite his mind telling him he had more important things to do. But before he could converse with her any further, he heard footsteps on the stairs leading into the brig. Captain, Lee appeared at his side, too early for lunch to be served. What is it, Lee? Neji didn't want to be annoyed at his first mate, but he also didn't like being disturbed when he was speaking with his captive. Kiba has spotted a ship in the distance, traveling in our direction. It could be nothing, but he wanted to make sure you were aware of it. Pirates? If they were, Neji would be more than happy to fight them head-on. Otherwise, he would rather continue undisturbed, not only because their arrival at Kirigakure was time-sensitive, but also because he didn't want to risk any harm coming to his captive if a fight broke out. Nay, Captain. 'Tis a Navy ship. Keep an eye on them but let them be. We are too busy to have a skirmish with the Navy right now. Aye, Captain. I will inform you if anything changes. Neji nodded, satisfied that his men would do their jobs properly. He didn't believe the naval ship would bother them, but he wasn't going to be caught off guard either. Good. You may go. Turning back to look at his pretty captive, Neji was startled to see the color had drained from her face and she was shaking even more than on her first day in the hold, when she had been freezing. He frowned, worried that she had suddenly become ill. Are you well? He asked her, trying to keep the concern from his tone. It wouldn't do him any good if his captive found out he had taken a shine to her. Her eyes met his, wild and frightened. What did she have to be frightened about? Don't engage with them, she said, her voice an unsteady plea. Please, if they come after you, don't fight them. Was she worried about a battle? No doubt, if this were her first time on a ship, of course she would be a little apprehensive. Neji tried to give her a comforting smile, though he wasn't sure it worked. You do not need to be afraid. My men are skilled fighters, and I will not let harm come to you. But his captive was shaking her head, her body trembling uncontrollably. No, 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 no you can't, please. He wasn't sure why this was upsetting her, and Neji did not know how to comfort her, so he tried to change the topic. I am getting tired of calling you, lady, all the time. Will you tell me your name so I can call you appropriately? Her head snapped up to his, as though it was the first time he had asked her the question. She paled further, making Neji more concerned that something was ailing her. No, I won't tell you. Maybe, she paused, thinking, and then met his gaze. If you flee from them, I will tell you. What made her so certain that the Navy ship would attack them? Lee had said they were a distance away, and naval ships rarely tried to fight pirates if they did not have backup. They knew pirates had a reputation of fighting dirty. Neji wasn't worried, but his captive seemed to think it inevitable that a fight would ensue. I am afraid that I cannot make such a promise, he told her. I am a pirate. If someone wishes to go against me, then they will regret it. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Neji heard feet pounding down the stairs to the brig. Captain. They are heading towards us and readying their cannons. Lee's voice was loud and urgent in the quiet of the room, but Neji was still able to make out the sharp intake of breath from inside the cell. Tell Naruto and Sasuke to ready the cannons, then. If a fight is what they want, then a fight is what they shall have. Lee nodded and hurried to do his bidding. Neji stood, knowing his men needed direction, though he didn't want to leave his captive alone in her cell. A part of him wanted to stay and reassure her, but he knew he couldn't. He was the captain, and it was his duty to make sure they came out victorious from this fight. He needed to be with his crew. Wait. His captive scrambled to her feet and clutched at the cell doors, just inches from where he was standing. Her eyes held fear like he had never seen before. At least give me a knife or a dagger to defend myself. I'll die otherwise. Neji frowned, not only because she wanted a weapon to defend herself against the Navy, people she should be overjoyed to see at that moment, but also because of the finality of her voice. Did she truly believe she would be killed in this skirmish? I will not let you die. You will be safe here. Neji longed to do something more, to prove he would keep his word. But he did not know what he could do to ensure her trust. I will keep you safe, he promised, his voice low. Neji reached a hand through the bars and stroked a finger against her cheek, his eyes fixed on hers as he silently willed her to believe him. Instead of being comforted, she shook her head and stepped away from the grates, a look of defeat on her face. She didn't believe him. Neji was surprised at how much that hurt, but he could not fault her for the lack of trust. They may have formed a rapport over the last few days, but she was still his prisoner. He turned his back on her and made his way up the stairs, mind turning to the impending battle. He would take care of this problem, but he wouldn't stay away from his captive for long. It was about time Neji learned who she really was. Tenten felt another shudder rack her body as she watched the captain disappear from sight. She hoped she was wrong, but in her heart she knew she wasn't. Her fiancé had found her. It didn't matter how, but she knew it was him. Every fiber in her being knew he had come for her, and he wouldn't stop until he found her. Hedan was a vicious man, one who had been close to her father for many years. She had known her father was violent, had taken the brunt of that violence on more than one occasion herself, but she never believed he would do something as cruel as give her to Hedan. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, kind and generous to the public, but sadistic and cruel behind closed doors. Tenten knew from the day her father promised her to Hedan that she would have to run, to get as far away from him as possible. She thought she had time to gather clothes, money, food, enough to get herself to safety. She had thought wrong. The evening she fled, Tenten's father informed her that Hedan would be arriving the next day, and that their nuptials would be held immediately. The words had sickened her to the core, and Tenten knew that if she didn't leave straight away, she would be nailing her own coffin. As soon as she left her father's study, Tenten had fled. She ran and ran until she made it to the docks, finding a lone ship that she knew would take her away from her cruel fiancé. She should have known she couldn't escape him, though. Hedan always got what he wanted, and for some twisted reason, he wanted her. But he wouldn't get her. Tenten would kill herself before she allowed Hedan to lay a finger on her. Tenten stumbled when a cannon hit the ship, disturbing the freakout she was in the middle of. She shook her head, determined to rid herself of her cowardly thoughts. She was not going to die today. She would find some way to get out of this cell where she was trapped and find a better place to hide. She would find a weapon and defend herself, and she would kill him if he came near her. Another cannon hit the ship, so close that Tenten screamed, falling to the floor from the force of the rocking vessel. Wood splintered and light flooded in from outside only a few inches from her position. Tenten eyed the gaping hole the cannon had made before turning to look where it landed. She gasped at her good fortune. The cannon had knocked her cell door from its hinges, allowing her the opportunity to escape. Doubt made her pause for a moment. What if the naval officers were already on board, looking for her? What if the pirate crew mistook her for an enemy and struck her down? She shook her head again. This was no time to be thinking negatively. She needed to keep her head on straight. She wasn't safe here, trapped in this room with no escape route. She needed a better place to hide, somewhere Hedan wouldn't be able to find her. After another brief pep talk to herself, Tenten got to her feet and crept towards the front of her cell. She knew it was risky going above deck with all the fighting going on, but she didn't have a choice. Taking a deep breath, Tenten made her way slowly up the stairs, the sound of battle getting louder the more she ascended. She eyed the gruesome scene with horror, and Tenten was suddenly glad she hadn't yet eaten. She fought the sudden urge to vomit on the wooden deck. Tenten was used to violence, but not on this scale. All around her, pirates and sailors fought against each other, their cutlasses clanging loudly despite the creaking wood and shouted insults that filled the air. Blood soaked the deck, and Tenten could see more than a few people lying unmoving, their bodies soaked with deep crimson. Tenten knew she should not be siding with either party, but a small part of her cheered the pirates on, hoping they won against their foes. She refused to even think about what would happen to her if they lost. It took great effort, but she forced herself to pry her eyes away from the fighting. This was no time to be distracted. She needed to find somewhere to hide, but where? She could try and make it to the storeroom again, find a dark nook and keep hidden. If given enough time, she could move crates and barrels to form a protective cocoon around her, a barrier big enough to hide her in. With the decision made, Tenten started in the direction of the storeroom. She had exited the brig towards the back of the ship, and the storeroom was in the middle, so she had to try and cross the deck without being seen. She kept low, not wanting to draw attention to herself, and tried to stick to the outside of the ship. Tenten knew she wouldn't be completely invisible, but she hoped that no one would pay attention to her with all the fighting going on. She had made it halfway when she heard a voice that stopped her dead in her tracks, her anxiety piking instantly. "If it isn't my fiancé," Hedan called from behind her. "I had a feeling I'd find you here, with these worthless bastards." Tenten's body locked up at the sound of his voice, her fight or flight instincts struggling for dominance. But she could do neither. There was nowhere to flee, and she had not yet procured a weapon with which to fight. She had been found, and now she would pay for fleeing from her intended. "Imagine my surprise when I arrived on your island to hear you were nowhere to be found." His voice was conversational, as though they were back in her living room, sitting down for morning tea. But Tenten could hear the steel underneath. He was furious, and he would make her regret her actions. "You're a long way from home, my dear," he continued. "Fortunately, I have come to take you back." Slowly, Tenten turned around to face her fiancé. She wanted to scream at him, to wail and rage, but she knew it would be futile. The more she did to provoke him, the worse her punishment would be. She had been punished enough by her father to know this, and he was a saint in comparison to Hedan. "I'm not going back with you," she replied, grateful her voice sounded stronger than she felt. She glared at him, balling her hands into fists by her side to stop them from shaking. "I would rather die than go back with you." A slow, sadistic smirk graced his lips and Tenten's stomach roiled the sight. He truly was a twisted, sick man. "That is unfortunate to hear, my dear. And I will grant your wish eventually. But first, it is time you and I went home." Tenten had wanted to argue with him a little longer, hoping that by doing so he would let down his guard enough that she could run. Of course, she knew she wouldn't be able to get far, but she needed, to be as far away from him as possible. Unfortunately, he was finished speaking, and she could only stand there, frozen in fear, as he slowly stalked towards her. "What the hell is she doing up here?" Neji thought to himself, anger burning in his chest at the sight of his captive sneaking along the deck. She had escaped her prison cell and was risking her neck up here, where the battle was raging. Could she truly be that foolish? But despite his anger, his mind told him to move closer to her, to make sure she was protected from the enemy. Neji's heart thudded in his chest when he noticed a figure following silently after her from a distance, the intent clear despite him being on the opposite side of the ship. He quickly dispatched the opponent he was fighting, without feeling the thrill of battle and adventure he usually felt. He barked an order at his men to keep on the offense before following the two figures. As he crept closer, Neji couldn't help but notice the rigid way his captive held herself, or that she was shaking like a leaf, despite the warm sea breeze. Then he saw her face, and her features stopped him cold. Pure, unadulterated fear held her in place as she looked at the man who had finally cornered her. She was terrified of this stranger, and Neji wondered if he was the reason she hadn't wanted them to engage in battle in the first place. "What business do you have with my prisoner?" he asked in a loud voice, ensuring it carried over the sounds of fighting surrounding them. The naval officer turned at the sound of his voice, his lips lifting into a sneer at the sight of Neji. "I could get you all hanged for stealing my fiancée and keeping her prisoner on your ship. Thankfully, I would much rather cut you down here than wait for justice to be served." Fiancé? Neji's captive was this person's fiancé? If that were the case, why did she look so scared of him? Was he the reason she had stowed away on his ship? Neji did not know all the details, but he didn't need to. This man would not be going anywhere near his captive, not when she was so clearly terrified of him. Neji would make sure of it. "I am afraid that will not be happening," Neji replied casually, lifting his cutlass in front of him. "You will not be making it off my ship alive." Tenten backed away as the two men came together, the sound of steel against steel ringing in the air. Hedan was furious, she knew, but more surprising was the look on the captain's face. Neji's features were set in a hard line, and he refused to give Hedan an inch, no matter how viciously her fiancé fought. The Navy ship was still firing cannons, much to Tenten's surprise. She would think, with comrades on board, they would be more careful, but they continued to fire their cannons despite the risk to their own men. With each hit, she felt the ship shake and she had to grip the side of the vessel to keep herself steady. Watching the men in front of her, Tenten silently rooted for her pirate captain. Out of the two of them, Tenten knew he was the better person. He had shown her kindness and she couldn't help but be attracted to the intelligence he possessed, which had taken her by surprise. She hadn't expected him to be so smart, but she found she enjoyed the various topics he not only brought up during his visits, but with his deep knowledge of those topics as well. And he had shown her a wit she had not expected to see, despite his almost sour-like demeanor. Even though he was a pirate, Tenten had come to realize that Neji Hyuga was a good man. A much better man than Hedan, that was for sure. The men were still fighting, throwing taunts and jabs at each other with each swing of their blade. The battle, too, continued to rage on, with no end in sight, and Tenten wondered if this was how all skirmishes at sea were like. Would they continue to battle until neither side had anyone left? Would she be the only one standing at the end of it, or would she too perish this day? No sooner had she thought the last question, than a cannon hit the side of the pirate ship so violently that she was unable to stop herself from pitching forward over the railing she had been clinging onto. Her eyes widened and she tried to grapple for a handle on the side of the ship, but her fingers couldn't find purchase, and she fell to the icy sea below. Neji saw it happen as though in slow motion. He had been keeping an eye on his captive, making sure she stayed away from the fight, and yet he knew he would not be able to reach her in time as he saw her being thrown overboard. The blast of the cannon rocked the ship, and only his years of being out at sea helped him stay balanced. A feeling of dread overtook him as he watched her stumble and fall over the side of his ship, unable to save herself. Being as distracted as he was, he almost missed his opponent's lunge for him, and only barely managed to block the attack. The blade grazed his arm instead of his chest, but even the sharp bite of pain could not stop the pounding of his heart. He needed to rescue her, but he couldn't step away from this fight. "You're looking a little pale there, Captain," his opponent noted, almost cheerfully. "Am I to guess that my dear fiancée found her way to the fishes?" He shot a quick glance over his shoulder before turning back to him with a smirk. "A shame. I was looking forward to killing her myself." Neji's blood boiled at his words and he charged forward to attack. "You would kill your own fiancée?" He spat, the steel of his sword glancing off his opponent's. "I would have kept her for a time, first. I deserve my husbandly dues, do I not? But yes, ultimately both her and her father would have been seeing my blade." He spoke so casually, as if killing an innocent woman was not a heinous crime. Neji understood a little more why his captive had been so afraid of him, but his words only fueled Neji's own anger. "Too bad, you will never get the chance," he sneered. Neji worked fast, knowing that with each second he wasted here was another second his captive was in danger of drowning. And that was something he would not allow to happen. He advanced aggressively, using all his years of training to push his opponent back despite the man's attempts to defend himself. Neji swung wide and his opponent blocked him, which was exactly what Neji had expected. He pulled a dagger from his belt and plunged it through the man's heart, ending his life more swiftly than Neji would have preferred. But time was of the essence, and he could not spend it cutting this bastard to pieces. "Captain," Lee ran up to him, breathless from the fight. His eyes were bright, the battle energizing him, and he looked from his captain to the man who had just been dispatched. "Lee, tell the crew to finish quickly and tie whoever's left alive up on their boat. No more toying with their opponents." "Aye, Captain." His first mate gave him a confused look when Neji handed him his sword. "What are you doing?" "Make sure someone is standing nearby to haul me back onto my ship," he said, ignoring the look of surprise on Lee's face. "I have a damsel in distress to rescue." The water was cold, much colder than he was anticipating, and Neji feared that he may have taken too long. That he may be too late. The water was clear, though, despite being churned up by the rocking of the ships, and Neji was able to see below the surface relatively well. He couldn't see her, and he feared the thought that she had been crushed by the weight of the ship. "Over here!" A very feminine voice yelled, laced with panic. Neji spun in the water and saw a figure waving at him from a distance. Relief flowed through him at the sight of her, and he used his powerful arms to swim towards her. "Are you injured?" he asked. She was treading water, but Neji could tell she was tiring easily, and he used his arm to draw her close to him. If she asked, he would say it was to conserve her energy, but that would not be the whole truth. He did not know why, but he wanted to be close to her right now, to make sure that she was okay. "I'm fine." A little terrified, but fine. She tried to give him a smile, but it was strained. "What happened to Hedan? Is he?" "I take it that was your fiancé's name?" he asked, the shaky tone to her voice making him want to kill the man all over again. "You do not need to fear him anymore. He is dead." She let out a long breath and he felt her sag against him at the knowledge. Tension she must have been keeping with her for so long suddenly lifting from her shoulders. "I know it's a horrible thing to say about a person, but I'm glad. I think if you had told me he was up there waiting, I would have taken my chances with the sharks." Neji longed to know the details of why Hedan had made her so scared, but first he needed to see to her safety. Holding her around the waist with one arm, Neji started swimming back to the ship, where he knew someone would be waiting for them. "I believe you owe me your name now," he said, trying to keep his voice light. He wanted to distract her from thoughts of the carnage she had witnessed, something no lady should ever have to see. She turned to face him with raised eyebrows, and Neji noticed that her lips were already starting to turn blue. A thought occurred to him, that he knew the perfect way to warm those lips up, but he banished the image immediately. This was no time to be thinking such things. His captive shivered in his arms, and Neji pushed harder towards his ship. "Oh, and why is that? You have had a bath, courtesy of the ocean?" She laughed, a beautiful, amused sound that Neji instantly wanted to hear again. "That doesn't count, and you know it." "Then, for killing your fiancé." Surely, he deserved much more than her name, but Neji would not be greedy. Her name would be worth gold itself, with how much he had been longing to learn it. "I suppose you deserve that, at the very least." She turned to face him again and he stopped paddling, his breath caught in his throat as he awaited her words. "My name is Tenten. Tenten Matashi." Her family name rang a bell, but in that moment Neji couldn't care less as to why. He knew he would think about it later, but for now, all that mattered was her. He finally knew her name, a name that seemed to suit her perfectly, a name as pretty as the owner. Neji resumed swimming towards the ship, repeatedly playing her name in his mind. Despite the warm day, Tenten shivered against the breeze, her clothes soaked through from the seawater. One of the crew members had hauled both her and the captain up and she found herself once again on the deck of the pirate ship. Which, after almost dying by both her fiancé's hand as well as the sea, Tenten wasn't in the mood to complain. These people, these supposedly barbarian people, had been kind to her. Their captain had treated her with more kindness than anyone had in a very long time, despite the brig she had been made to stay in. The fighting had stopped some time while Tenten was in the water, and pirates were binding their enemies with rope before sending them back to their ship by means of a plank set up between the two vessels. Tenten was curious to know how the pirates had won, but she was too cold to ask. Instead, she let herself be led by the captain as he escorted her across the deck. At first, she thought he might be taking her back to the brig, but surely not, with the hole gaping in the middle of it. She would freeze to death if she had to spend any more time there. But when he steered her towards what she suspected was the captain's quarters, Tenten began to worry that he might want something in exchange for saving her life. She was still his captive, after all, and he had every right, at least in his mind, to demand compensation. Especially once he found out that the attack had happened because of her. She had no idea how many men he had lost in that battle or what feelings and emotions were swirling around inside his head. Neji opened the door and she walked inside to a relatively large, spacious room that contained a desk near the entrance, along with a bookshelf that she suspected was bolted into the floor. Further inside, a bed leaned against a wall with a small window above it. Just beyond that lay a door where Tenten suspected held the bathroom. Tenten was instantly grateful for the lack of wind in the room, and she shivered at the abrupt change in temperature. Tenten had never felt this cold before in her life, and she wouldn't be surprised if her lips had started turning blue by this point. She was exhausted from treading water for so long and all she wanted was a hot bath followed by a soft bed. Neji spoke to a cabin boy at the door before turning back to face her. His own clothes were drenched, his long dark hair plastered to his skin, and he didn't look any better than she felt. No doubt the last thing he wanted to do was look after her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his soft voice sounding loud in the quiet room. Tenten shook her head in response. "No, just cold. Konohamaru is fetching some water for a bath, so you can warm yourself soon." Not expecting that comment, Tenten was shocked. "I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but why are you drawing a bath for me?" She figured he would give her a change of clothes at best. She hadn't even contemplated receiving a bath from him, especially since he had refused every time she had asked him up until this point. "If you do not get warm soon, you will become sick." Tenten didn't doubt it. Already she could feel her nose starting to run. She was extremely grateful for being allowed a bath, but she didn't quite know how to tell him that. It wasn't as though they were suddenly friends after surviving such a harrowing ordeal. She stepped aside as a boy, no older than 12, walked in and out of the cabin, carrying buckets of water to fill the tub as he went. "While it is getting ready," Neji said, opening a trunk by his bed and pulling 2 small towels from it. He threw one to her. "I believe you owe me an explanation. Why were you running from your fiancé?" Tenten wrapped the towel around her shoulders, her heart sinking at the topic of conversation he chose to pursue. But she supposed she owed him an explanation, at the very least. She sat down at the edge of the bed, unable to look at him. He was a cruel man. He hid it well and he was respected by many within the Navy, but he had an evil about him that my father noticed straight away. He quickly became my father's right-hand man, doing many of the dirty jobs a mayor would never do himself. Amongst other things, he killed people. Neji was leaning against the opposite wall, listening quietly, but he didn't look convinced. Many of us kill people. That does not necessarily make a person cruel. No, that's true. But liking it does. I heard him speaking to my father about how much he enjoyed planning his kills, of how he relished the blank look of death on people's faces when the deed was completed. He was unhinged, though he hid it well from much of the populace. Tenten fidgeted where she sat, eyeing the bath through the open door to the bathroom as it continued to rise with each bucket the cabin boy poured in. She could see the steam rising from the tub and absent-mindedly wondered how they were able to heat the water so much. She was grateful for being able to bathe, to get truly warm and clean, but she was still wary of her pirate captain. What would he do with her now that the danger had passed? Neji caught her looking at him and he frowned. "You're looking pale. Are you unwell?" Neji hurried Konohamaru along in his mind, knowing his cabin boy could only go so fast. Thankfully, the bath was almost ready, and Tenten could soon warm her chilled bones. Her lips were blue, and she had gone pale in the last few moments, making him worry for her well-being. She shuffled her feet together, her hands wringing together in her lap, and Neji got the impression she wanted to say something but was too scared to ask. "What is it? What are your plans for me now? Are you going to demand money from my father? Are you going to kill me? Or," she glanced towards the bed quickly, "do you want something else from me? Why should I demand ransom from your father?" If she believed he would harm her now, after he had saved her life, she was dafter than he had originally thought. His captive had the gall to glare at him, much to his relief. If she still had spirit, she must be feeling better. "Surely you must know who I am, now that I've told you my name." Neji pondered over her surname, having brushed it aside when she had first told him. At the time, he had been more interested in her Christian name instead. Her family name was familiar, and it only took him a few moments to realize why. Neji had once considered plundering the mayor's storehouses, having heard the man's habit of demanding more taxes from the people than was needed. He was incredibly wealthy, so much so that Neji knew he could afford losing some coin. In the end, though, he had decided to pass on that endeavor, since the risk, if the job had gone south, would have outweighed the reward. Thinking about it now, he had heard the stoic mayor had a daughter nearing marriageable age, but he had thought nothing of it. Would he have met her if he had chosen to go ahead with that plan? If so, what would she have thought of him? "You have no need to fear," Neji assured her, trying to keep his voice placating. "No harm will come to you on my ship. Nor will you be held for ransom." Even if the coin were tempting, Neji wouldn't want her to find her way back to her father. No doubt, he had been the one to orchestrate the marriage alliance between her fiancé and her, and anyone who would pair a woman such as she with a beast didn't deserve her in their life. Neji saw the tension fall away from her shoulders, and when she met his gaze, the relief shining in her eyes was evident. "Thank you. Though, even if you were to demand ransom, he wouldn't have paid. The only loss he will mourn will be the loss of an alliance of any kind, not the loss of his only daughter. I am glad to be away from him and his violent tendencies." She smiled, but Neji could tell the words hurt her to say, and he felt anger rise in his chest that she had experienced such cruelness in her life. "The bath is ready, Captain," Konohamaru informed him, the young boy gazing up at him with admiration. Neji gave him a brief smile, nodding his thanks, and Konohamaru left the cabin, shutting the door behind him. Neji walked back to the chest by his bed and picked out a plain white long-sleeved shirt before handing it to Tenten. "2 baths in one day? I feel like I'm getting the royal treatment." Her voice was amused but her smile was shy, and Neji found he enjoyed the combination. His return smile was brief but genuine. He wanted to continue the banter, say something to make her laugh, but he wasn't sure what to say. Lee would know, but Neji wasn't known for his sense of humor. Instead, he only said, "Take your time," and turned towards his desk. The bath was heavenly. Tenten had only been at sea for just over a week, but already she had forgotten just how amazing a hot bath was. She did indeed take her time, washing her hair twice with soap she found, as well as her aching body. She leaned against the edge of the tub after she was done, enjoying the way the heat soothed her sore muscles and warmed her from the inside out. It was only when the water had cooled that Tenten pulled herself out of the tub and dried off. She slipped the shirt over her head, thankful towards the captain for providing it for her. If only she had asked for pants, though. The shirt didn't quite reach her knees, and Tenten suddenly felt very self-conscious. She had never been in the presence of the opposite sex with so little on. Opening the door slowly, she peeked out into the cabin. Neji was sitting at his desk, concentrating on something he was writing. Tenten took a deep breath and walked into the cabin, but immediately became shy when he looked up and ran his gaze over her. She wasn't sure why, but his gaze heated her skin more than the bath had, and she quickly averted her eyes from his, finding the knickknacks on his shelf extremely interesting. Konohamaru will arrive soon with some food, Neji said, causing her to glance at him again. You may eat while I bathe. He stood up and made his way to the bathing room, and Tenten suddenly felt contrite. Will he not fill it again for you? She asked. She hadn't even been thinking of the captain, and she hoped she hadn't just selfishly used all the hot water on him. Baths are a luxury on a ship. It would be a waste to use more water than necessary by emptying the tub and filling it again. I'm really sorry, Tenten apologized. You should have told me. I wouldn't have spent so long in there. The water will be cold by now. It is fine. I am used to cold baths. Besides, he added, that small smile gracing his lips again briefly. You needed it, after the ordeal you have gone through. Tenten felt her heart warm at his words, at such an unexpected gift from this pirate captain. Thank you. I'm very grateful. They gazed at each other, unmoving, until a knock at the door made Tenten jump. Neji closed the bathroom door behind him and Tenten opened the cabin door to see the young boy with 2 trays of food in his hands. Food for you in the cabin, miss, he said, squeezing past her into the room. He set them down on Neji's desk before giving her a small bow and leaving again. The smell of stew, yes, stew, made Tenten salivate. She was sitting at the desk in a heartbeat with the bowl in her hands, breathing in the delicious smell. She ate ravenously, and the food was gone much too soon. She eyed the captain's meal longingly, her stomach giving a pathetic rumble. You are welcome to mine. Tenten whipped her head up and around, her cheeks pinkening at both his words and the sight before her. His hair was damp, and his pants rode low at his waist. He was shirtless, and Tenten tried, unsuccessfully, not to ogle his muscular build. She shook her head and pushed the bowl towards him. One couldn't possibly. I already stole all the hot water. Besides, I've had my fill. On cue, her belly rumbled and Tenten flushed, embarrassed. Neji's lips tipped upwards at the noise, and he pushed the bowl back to her. I insist. Eat. She did as she was told, though she ate the second bowl with more etiquette. While she ate, Neji leaned against the door of the cabin opposite her, watching. After some time, he asked, What are your plans now? My plans? Tenten glanced at him, a frown on her lips. What do you mean? Now that your fiancé is dead and you no longer live with your father, what do you plan on doing? What was your objective when you came aboard my ship? Tenten worried her lip, thinking. My plans were to get off at the next port you stopped at and start a new life. Though, I admit I don't have much in the way of money. Or clothes, she added with a glance at her attire. Neji nodded. You are welcome to leave the ship at the next port if that is your wish. Although, our next port will be Kirigakure, and I have to warn you that it is not the safest place for a young woman by herself. Tenten had heard of Kirigakure, and nothing she heard had been pleasant. If she were to set up in a new town, she didn't want to start a new life in a town rampant with violence and theft. Maybe I should wait for a friendlier town, she murmured. You are welcome to stay on board until we make port at a more suitable village. Would I be welcome to? She let her words peter out, knowing she would be insane to voice them. But if she was going to be staying on board for the foreseeable future as it was, maybe the captain wouldn't mind. Taking a deep breath, Tenten asked, Would I be welcome to stay and work on board? I think I would enjoy some time at sea after my sheltered life at home. Neji's eyebrows instantly rose at her question, but he instantly schooled his features back into a blank line. I do not hire women. Her heart dropped and she looked down at her lap. Of course, forgive me for asking. I know about the superstition about women on ships. She felt him push off against the door and walk towards her, but she didn't look up. I do not care for superstitions, Tenten. Her name on his lips made her heart race and she glanced up at him, who was now directly in front of her on the other side of the desk. I will not hire you, but you are welcome to stay on board. His lips tipped up, just slightly. If you wish for adventure, you will see plenty of it aboard my ship. I can stay? Tenten couldn't quite believe her ears. Can I help with the chores? Learn how to use a sword? Her father had refused to let her learn, though she had wanted to since she was a little girl. She had held a sword, only once, and Tenten had known in her gut that she would have an affinity for the weapon if only she was given the opportunity to learn how to wield it. You wish to work with my men and learn to fight? He looked at her, incredulous. She nodded enthusiastically. Yes, please. Even if you don't hire me, I will work. I'm not going to sit around doing nothing while others work. I've spent my whole life bored in a house that was much too large for me, so this will be a pleasant change of pace. He raised an eyebrow at her. Do you forget that we are pirates? Of course, Tenten had loathed him and his crew when she first came aboard, not just them, but all pirates. And she had no doubt that there were pirates out there that were truly horrible, but Neji and his men had shown they were decent people. They killed when necessary, but not excessively, and the few she had met had been kind to her. If the captain was a good person at heart, she had no doubt he chose similar men to work with him. She smiled. Yes, but I also believe you are good people. I would very much like to stay on board for as long as you will have me. Very well. He nodded his acceptance, a smile playing on his lips. Welcome to the Crimson Knight, Tenten, he said, his eyes twinkling with mirth. I hope you enjoy your stay. The wind blew locks of Tenten's chocolate-brown hair into her face, having not tied it up that morning. She was currently regretting that decision, as she didn't have the time to take care of the wayward locks now, her mind and body intent on the person in front of her. The first mate, Rock Lee, circled her slowly, his blade pointed in her direction. Her own blade was drawn and raised to match his stance, though her arm was beginning to tire now, having spent a good portion of the morning training. She heard their crewmates shouting in the background, encouraging her on as they walked by. Never in Tenten's life had she anticipated that she would one day be aboard a pirate ship, let alone have friends amongst those pirates. She had always thought of them as vile people who didn't care about anyone but themselves, but the pirates on this ship had proved her wrong. The crewmates she had met so far, 1 month into her journey, had been friendly to her, despite her being unable to spend much time with them. Rock Lee had proved to be an invaluable friend to her since her agreement to stay aboard the Crimson Knight. After she had pleaded with the captain to be allowed to learn the sword, Lee had been more than happy to give of his time to train her. She was grateful to the first mate, and he had taught her a lot during their short time together. Tenten's arms ached daily from her training, but she could feel her body strengthening, and she reveled in the pain. It meant she was improving. No longer would Tenten be useless in a fight, something she had despised for years. If she had been taught how to defend herself at a young age, she would have been able to stand up to her father's abuse over the years, maybe even been able to stop it. You are a born natural, Tenten, Lee commented from his place in front of her. Sweat marked his forehead, his clothes were in disarray from their training, and he was panting under the blazing sun. Tenten knew she must look similar but couldn't bring herself to care. It was so freeing, not being treated like a genteel lady, too fragile to do anything meaningful. Her sword practice was by far the best fun she had ever had in her life. They tried to train each day if they could, though Tenten understood sometimes he was too busy to do so. On the occasions Lee didn't have time for her, Tenten would have to forego her training for the day, as no one else had volunteered to help her when he was busy. She grinned in response to Lee's comment, her heart warming at the praise. Her father had never praised her for anything, not even when she was little. Thank you, she replied. I've been wanting to learn for a long time but wasn't allowed, since it is unbecoming of a lady. She rolled her eyes, hating the sexism that was prevalent in society. Women were not seen as equals, but as lesser beings, born only to find a good match and produce heirs for men. Tenten had never wanted to get married, but since she was only a woman, she hadn't been given much choice in the matter. Thankfully, though, she had been able to escape before the hellish wedding could take place. Not for the first time since her fiancé died, Tenten wondered if her father would give up on her. At first, she was confident that he would, but the more she thought on it, the more her opinion changed. Her father wasn't one to be trifled with, and he had many allies he would like to pair her with in order to gain more power. No, she was surer now than ever that he wouldn't give her up, and the thought made her chest tighten with anxiety. His friends, like Hedan, were not nice people, and she did not wish to be paired with any of them. Tenten, are you well? Lee asked, breaking her out of her sudden musings. You are starting to pale. Perhaps you have had too much sun today. Oh, I'm fine. Sorry, Lee. Tenten didn't want to voice her concerns, lest she put the pirates on high alert. It was unlikely her father would be able to find her. Really, how would he know where she was? And she knew she was just upsetting herself by thinking of the worst-case scenario. Are you sure? We can take a break if you are tired. Shaking her head, Tenten lifted her cutlass once more in Lee's direction. I'm fine. It's too early to rest. The first mate lifted his own sword, the look of concern dropping from his face. Tenten had never lied to him about how her body was feeling during their lessons, so she knew he trusted that she was well enough to continue. A moment later the two came together, the sound of steel ringing on the air. The figures circled each other on the main deck, their knees bent slightly as they trained. Neji stood at the helm, glad for the sun that silhouetted his body and allowing him to look down on them as they trained without fear of being seen. Not that Neji was hiding, of course, but he also did not want his guest knowing he enjoyed watching her train whenever he could. She seemed to have an affinity with the blade, and it had only taken her a short time before she grasped the basics of it. Still, she was not yet a master. That would take some time, natural ability or not, but she was improving each day, and Neji couldn't help but be impressed by her. Her fighting skills weren't the only things Neji was impressed by, if he were being honest. There was much about her to admire, and that was where the problem lay. Most of his men enjoyed having a lady aboard, and he had to constantly remind them to keep their distance, and their manners, when it came to her. She was feisty and outspoken, and he had no doubt she could look after herself if any one of his crew tried anything untoward with her. But he did not want her feeling uncomfortable while on his ship, and so he made sure to keep his men in line. Telling his men to stay away was easy. Making sure he kept his distance from her was proving more difficult. He had been able to successfully keep his distance for the most part, but each day it became harder to do. He wanted to converse with her, to have her laugh for him the way she so easily seemed to do with Lee. But Neji was the captain. What would his men think if they noticed his interest in her? He could not claim mere curiosity anymore. Neji knew he had developed feelings for the woman since her appearance on the ship, and he did not know what to do about them. Neji turned away from the dueling figures, berating himself for becoming so easily distracted. He was on an important mission, one that he could not allow anyone to be unfocused from, especially himself. Neji turned to Shikamaru, conferring with his sailing master and making sure they were still on track. It was taking them longer to arrive at Kirigakure than he would like, due to the attack from the naval ship 2 weeks ago, but they were finally closing in on the town. Neji's body thrummed in anticipation. Any time away from his hometown was too long, but it was a necessary evil he had to live with. Soon, though, he would be home again, and he would be able to see those he loved in the flesh once more. A thought came to him suddenly, shocking him from his excitement. What would Tenten think when she learned the truth about him? She knew him only as a pirate captain, but how would she react upon discovering the other side of him? On top of that, how would she handle meeting his family? Would she like them? Neji had no doubt she would be accepted by them almost immediately, but he felt hesitant about telling her the truth about himself, though why, he did not know. He shook his head, dislodging the thought. It did not matter. She was a guest on his ship, nothing more. It should not matter what she might think of his family. Or him, for that matter, though that thought made his heart clench painfully in his chest. Neji had given himself the responsibility to be her guardian while on board. He would make sure she remained safe while she was on his ship, but it would be foolish of him if he allowed anything more to happen. As soon as he finished his business on Kirigakure, he would take her to a different village, somewhere he knew would be safe enough for her to settle down in. He would likely never see her again. Kirigakure may be his hometown, but he would not wish her to live there. Not while violence and corruption were a part of everyday life, and definitely not while the Duke remained in power. Turning his back, and thoughts, away from the woman on the deck below him, Neji strode towards his cabin. He had work to do, and he would get not done if he remained out here, watching a woman he had no hope of having. The rocking of the ship was the first thing Tenten felt upon awakening, as it was every morning. She couldn't quite remember why she had hated the feeling on her first few days aboard. Now it was a comfort, helping to lull her to sleep each night. Unlike the captain's quarters, the small cabin Tenten had been given had no windows, but she didn't mind. It wasn't as though she spent much time there anyway. The room was originally the first mate's, but Lee had graciously vacated so that she would have somewhere comfortable to sleep. Tenten was beyond grateful to him for the kindness, especially since he now had to sleep with the rest of the crew below decks. Tenten sometimes wondered what it would be like if she had stayed in the captain's cabin instead of being allowed this room for her personal use. The night of the attack, she had slept in Neji's bed, a welcome luxury after so many days on the hard ground. At the time, she had wondered if he would demand compensation for her rescue, and although the thought had frightened her, she had been embarrassed to feel parts of her body thrilling at the fantasy. Surprisingly though, for he was a pirate, not a gentleman, he had left her to her devices and vacated the room. She had no idea where he had slept for the evening, but she was thankful that he had done so. After such an exhausting day, it had not taken her long until she fell into a deep and restful sleep. The bed she now lay in wasn't nearly as comfortable as the captain's, but again, she couldn't complain. If Lee had not given up his room, where would she have been expected to sleep? With Neji in his cabin. For though he had left her alone that first night, she did not expect him to continue, seeing as though they were his quarters, or would she have had to bunk with the other deckhands, below decks where the men slept in close quarters, either on the floor or in hammocks. Sitting up, Tenten stretched her tired muscles. A dream lay just out of reach in her mind, and she tried to catch its fragments before it fled completely. All she knew was that it was of her pirate captain, but she could not remember the details. She could guess at its contents, though, as her body was still tingling from the dream and her face felt flushed with heat. It wasn't the first morning she had woken after an amorous dream of the captain, and Tenten was relieved she would likely not be seeing him again today. She did not think she would be able to act normal in front of him, not after having dreamed of them together in a passionate embrace. Tenten lit the lamps around her cabin before walking towards the small basin of water the captain had graciously allowed her to keep in her room. She understood that fresh water was hard to come by on ships, and she wouldn't have the luxury of baths like she had the day of her ex-fiancé's attack, but she was thankful for still being able to wash, at least with a sponge and some water. She would kill for another hot bath, but she wasn't going to ask. The men needed the water for drinking, though Lee had told her most of the crew drank rum instead as a substitute, or a combination of the two together. Stripping down, Tenten quickly ran the wet rag over her body, making herself as fresh as she could for the day ahead. Afterwards, she plaited her hair before twisting it atop her head and securing it in place with pins. A knock at the door indicated that breakfast was ready, and she took a moment to make sure she looked presentable before opening the oak door to see Konohamaru standing on the other side, food tray in hand. Neji had insisted that she eat in her room instead of the mess hall with his men, and she had agreed, not wanting to argue. But she was curious to know what it would be like, eating with a group of pirates. Most of them had been kind to her since they became aware of her presence on the ship, and she would like to talk to them more. Unfortunately, Neji had made it clear that she was not to distract them from their duties. Smiling at the young boy, she stepped aside to let him into the room. Konohamaru placed the tray at Lee's desk and gave her a bow, a toothy grin appearing on his face. "Your food, miss." "Thank you, Konohamaru," she replied kindly. Truly, how had such a young, sweet boy made his way onto a pirate ship? "Welcome, miss." Usually, Konohamaru dropped off her food and left quickly, in a hurry to complete his many other chores for the morning. But today he paused, his hands fidgeting in front of his body and his head turning to peer around at her small cabin. "Is something the matter?" she asked. "The captain said you won't be practicing swords with the first mate today." Oh, her heart sunk at the news. She thoroughly enjoyed her sparring sessions with Lee, and she didn't like it when she missed one. Despite her constant demands to be able to help around the ship, Neji was adamant that she was not to assist. The only thing he allowed her to do, outside of her sword lessons, was to help the men sew their sails whenever they needed mending. The fact that that was her only job raised Tenten's ire, but she was in no position to argue. "The captain will be your partner instead." Tenten's head snapped up, her eyes widening at the boy's words. The captain would be her sparring partner today. Her heart leapt in her chest at the news. He had been studiously leaving her to her own devices, and she had rarely spent time with him since he welcomed her aboard as his guest. Tenten wasn't sure if he was avoiding her, or if he was truly busy doing other things, but she constantly found herself wanting to spend more time with the enigmatic man. "Will he?" She kept her voice even, although inside she was a bundle of nerves and excitement, and embarrassment, as she thought back to the dream she had awoken from. She gave the boy another smile, this time larger, and said, "I will have to eat quickly, then, so as not to waste his time. Please tell the captain that I will be along shortly." Konohamaru ducked his head in response. Miss," he said to meet him on the quarterdeck when ready. "Thank you, Konohamaru." She turned to her food after he left, butterflies suddenly invading her stomach, so intense that she was unsure if she would be able to eat. After 2 weeks aboard his ship as a guest, Tenten was finally going to be able to spend some one-on-one time with the captain. She didn't know why the knowledge thrilled her, she only knew that it did. It was going to be an exciting day. It had been a stupid thing to do, informing his guest that he would spar with her today. Lee was perfectly capable of doing it, as he usually did, but Neji had purposely assigned him more work so that he would be too busy to train her. Neji had spent the evening arguing with himself over the decision. Half of him wanted to stay as far away from her as possible, aware the attraction he felt for her could become dangerous, while his other half wanted to do everything he could to spend as much time in her presence as possible. His irrational side had won out this morning, and before he could stop himself, he was giving his first mate more work to do and telling his cabin boy to inform his guest of the changes. He should regret it. Neji did not have time for flirtation or attraction, but he could not help himself. They would be making port at Kurogakure in the next few days and Neji wanted to spend time with his guest before becoming even busier once they reached shore. Neji waited on the quarterdeck, his cutlass hanging in its halter against his hip. The weapon felt heavy for once, and he knew it was because he would soon be using it against the dark-haired beauty. Although he knew they were only sparring, he still worried that he might somehow hurt her. She was capable, she had been a quick learner of the sport, but he was a trained swordsman. One false swipe from him and she could be gravely injured. The thought had him feeling that maybe this hadn't been a good idea, after all. How was Neji supposed to spar with her if he was in constant fear of hurting her? "Good morning, Captain." Her melodious voice cut through his worry and he turned around to see her standing a short distance away, looking absolutely charming in the tunic and breeches she had been given by one of the smaller crew members. She had tied her hair up in a bun atop her head, leaving her long slender neck open to his viewing. Neji gave her a nod, though he wanted to return the radiant smile she sent his way. His heart had picked up at the sight of her, and he silently tried to rein it in, lest it get ahead of itself. "Good morning, Tenten. I trust you slept well." "Yes, thank you." She ducked her head, and he wondered at the blush that covered her cheeks. He hadn't said something to embarrass her, had he? Neji reminded himself that he had other, important tasks to attend to, and that they should start her training immediately. He motioned her over and pulled out his cutlass, silently reminding himself to go easy on her. He needn't to though, since as soon as Tenten was ready, she charged him. It was not difficult to block her attack, but she kept up relentlessly, trying to push him back so she could find an opening. Neji was impressed, but she was far from being close to his level, and he easily held her at bay with his defense. "Lee has trained you well," he commented once they broke apart. Neji noticed that her breathing was already becoming labored. "Your stance when on offense needs work, though." Tenten paused, looking down at herself as if she could see the issue herself. Neji held back a smirk at the sight and stepped closer to her. "You leave yourself open to a counterattack. When on the offensive, do not stab at your opponent. Try this." Neji showed her the movements, stepping closer to an invisible opponent before bringing his sword down to attack. She watched him closely, but when she copied the movements, he shook his head. An idea occurred to him, one he knew he should not pursue but one he also knew he couldn't stop himself from doing. "Almost. Step slightly to the right as you move forward before bringing your sword down. Like this." Moving closer, Neji sheathed his sword before stepping behind his guest. He placed one hand on her sword arm and the other on her opposite hip, unable to ignore the way she felt in his arms. "Hold your sword out and step forward and to the right," he murmured, doing the motion with her. "Good. Now bring the sword down onto your opponent." He helped her do the motions once more, murmuring praises against her ear as she performed them more fluently. It took more effort than he thought it would to let go of Tenten and step back again, and Neji instantly felt the loss of her body against his. She turned to him, her face flushed and eyes not quite meeting his. Neji was aware he should apologize for the sudden intrusive lesson, but he couldn't bring himself to do so. They trained for a little longer, Tenten practicing the new stance while Neji gave her commendation and pointers when necessary. After a while, Neji heard Kiba call out from the crow's nest, signaling another ship on the horizon and startling Neji and his guest. Neji felt torn at the news. Part of him was excited with the prospect of a potential battle, while the other part of him was annoyed that his sparring session with Tenten would have to be cut short. His most keen seer called out again, letting Neji and the rest of the crew know the other ship were pirates, and Neji felt the shift in the air instantly. His men buzzed with anticipation as they ran to their posts, readying the ship for the inevitable battle. Neji himself had a job to do, but first he would have to talk to his guest, to make sure she knew of the dangers of what would come. "I am afraid we will have to stop here for today," he told her, sheathing his sword once more. She had a sheen of sweat on her forehead and her chocolate eyes were bright with excitement. The combination was titillating, and Neji had to force himself to focus on the battle ahead, not on her charming femininity. "Will you battle with the pirates?" She turned her neck to try and get a glimpse of the other vessel, but they were still too far away to see with the naked eye. "Yes. You will stay in your quarters until you are given instruction that it is safe to come out." Tenten's head snapped back to his, her delicate eyebrows pulled down and her mouth twisting into a frown. "You want me to hide?" "You will be safest there during the battle. But I can help, I want to fight with you." She held her head up in determination, giving him a stare that was both haughty and demanding. Such a look would not work on him, though. His charming guest may not be aware of it yet, but Neji could be very stubborn when he wished to be. And he would not budge on this conversation. "You will remain in your quarters." "But," he cut her off with a fierce glare. "I am not going to argue with you about this, Tenten. You are not trained enough to be of any help, and I will not risk my men's lives by having you out here, bumbling about." Bumbling about? I was not bumbling about. She hadn't been. In fact, Neji could agree that she was a quick learner, but training was different, and Neji would not risk it. These pirates will not care that you are new to learning the sword. They will not go easy on you. Tenten opened her mouth to say something, argue some more, he had no doubt, but Lee appeared at Neji's side, cutting off whatever she wanted to say. "The crew is waiting on your orders, Captain." "Of course." Neji turned to the angry, dark-haired beauty, and said, "You will go to your quarters now, Tenten. I will not ask again." She glared at him, and Neji knew that if looks could kill he would be writhing on the deck in agonizing pain. But he would not change his mind, and she would obey him as her captain. She must have realized she would not get her way, because she turned and stomped towards her cabin, her sword clutched tightly in her hand. "Captain," Lee said from beside him. Neji peeled his eyes away from the feminine figure and turned to his first mate. He nodded in acknowledgement. Now was not the time to be distracted by his feisty guest. He had to encourage his men and make sure they came out of this skirmish the victors. Tenten muttered curses under her breath the whole way back to her small room, her anger towards the pirate captain unable to be doused. She had been training vigorously almost every day for 2 weeks, and she was mad that he refused to let her prove her skills. It didn't take long before she made it to her room, and she slammed the door shut behind her. The room was dark, and she was forced to open the door again to let daylight in while she lighted candles around the space. After she was done, Tenten once again closed the door to her cabin and began to pace, trying in vain to calm her anger. She had never been one to sit idly by. Her father had tried to mold her into the perfect lady, one who sews and plays piano and does nothing except wait for the men to come home, but that wasn't in Tenten's nature. She was a lot like her mother, though she didn't remember her very well, having had passed away when Tenten was only young. She had few memories of the woman, but her nurse used to tell her stories of her late mother, and Tenten knew they would have been the best of friends if she were still alive. Many of the stories included her father, a man she didn't recognize with the man she knew now. Apparently, before her mother passed, her father had been a completely different person, kind, loving, humorous. But the death of his beloved had changed him completely. Tenten used to mourn the fact that she didn't know the man in the stories, but those feelings had long since passed, and now she was left with loathing for the man who sired her. Shouting sounded from beyond her cabin, the crew preparing for the upcoming battle. Tenten longed to be out there with them, to help the other crew members with their tasks. Though she was grateful to the captain for allowing her to stay aboard, there wasn't much he allowed her to do. For some reason, he didn't like her around his crew despite him having told her to make herself at home. And only after she pestered him had he allowed her to do small tasks around the ship. Sewing up holes in the sails wasn't the type of work she wanted to be doing, though, but he refused to allow her to do more physically demanding jobs. She longed to climb the rigging or help prepare the cannons. Something that worked her body, not just her hands. At least he had allowed her to practice her swordsmanship, but if he wasn't even going to let her use her newfound skills, what was the point? Tenten wanted to fight, not hide like a coward in her cabin. The ship rumbled and shook, the faint sound of a cannon being fired sounding in the air. A few moments later, an answering cannon shook the ship. Tenten was prepared, though, and she was able to keep her balance. Weeks on board the ship had helped her develop her sea legs. Tenten struggled to think of other things, not the fight that was ongoing outside her door. She paced the floor, going through the techniques Lee had taught her during their sparring lessons. Your opponents are not going to go easy on you, just because you are female, he had told her, slashing at her face with his sword. The attack had made her stumble back in shock and fear, and at the time, she hadn't known why he was being so aggressive. But now, with the knowledge that another pirate ship was trying to attack them, she understood. If they do not kill you, they will take you captive. If you know you cannot win, pray for death, for they will not treat a woman kindly, and you will wish they had killed you after they are through with you. A shudder ran through her at the memory of what Lee had told her, his face dark as he let the words sink in. There was no way in hell she would let them take her alive. She would go down swinging if they even tried to touch her. She hadn't escaped her ex-fiancé just to be taken by some other depraved, disgusting individuals. Her thoughts were stilled when a thud sounded just outside her door. She crept towards the entrance and heard the grunts and curses of men on the deck. A stab of fear shot through her, but Tenten refused to cower. She was a part of this crew now, albeit for a short time, and she would defend this ship as good as any other crew member. When the sounds of the men faded, Tenten cracked the door to her cabin open a sliver and peered out, steeling herself for the sight she knew she was about to see. To hell with the captain's orders. Much to Neji's frustration, they had been boarded. That was twice now, in a little over 2 weeks. Neji made a mental note to do more drills with his men so this didn't happen again. Being boarded made defending one's vessel more difficult, and Neji especially didn't want any mistakes made while his guest was on board. She was much too precious to gamble with. Thankfully, his men refused to let their guards down, and they fought well as the opposing pirates started to board the Crimson Knight. Neji found himself hovering near the first mate's cabin, reluctant to move away. He felt the need to make sure Tenten was safe and that no one ventured to where she was hiding. He knew their enemy had no idea a woman was on board, but it made him calm being close to her, in case anything were to happen. There were many men on the other pirate ship, the crew being at least double the size of Neji's, and as Neji came together with his first opponent, he realized why. They fought in numbers because their sword skills were lacking. Their strategy being to overwhelm the enemy with quantity rather than quality. Neji almost scoffed at the audacity of them. Their captain obviously had no idea how important Neji took his crew's sword training. He was his men would be able to hold their own, even with the high number of adversaries clambering aboard. Neji did his best to dispatch his opponents without killing them, while not venturing too far from Tenten's cabin. The enemy pirates could easily tell that Neji was the captain by his outfit, and they teamed up to try and take him down. They knew that if they could kill the captain, the rest of the crew would surrender. But Neji had no intention of dying, and he refused to be cornered by these men who could barely hold their swords properly. Despite their lack of skill, the opposing pirates were ruthless, and Neji had to fight three off at once, grabbing his dagger to use alongside his sword. He growled at his opponents, frustrated with the turn of events that had taken place. He could be enjoying a leisurely morning with a certain chocolate-eyed lady if it weren't for these louts. His crew knew not to kill their opponents unless absolutely necessary, something Neji had instilled in them from day one. Neji understood that many men who took up pirating had little choice, and they were only trying to make a living. Of course, he knew of some depraved pirates that reveled in killing innocents and plundering women, and for these Neji didn't hesitate to kill. But for others, such as this motley crew, Neji wanted to spare, if possible. No doubt many of these men had wives and children of their own, and they were doing the only thing they could to support their families. Neji knew that despite being careful, there would still be some deaths as he and his men defended themselves, but that was the inevitable way of things. Pirates knew that every battle may be their last, and they did not cower from it. One of his opponents broke away and Neji kept an eye on him while fighting against the other two. He lost sight, though, and had to keep his focus on the two men in front of him, lest he let down his guard. Neji could only hope that the third pirate had found someone else to fight, since he was currently too busy to look for him. The blood didn't affect her as much as last time, though Tenten's stomach still roiled at the sight of the slick deck and the countless bodies fighting in such close quarters. A thought stopped her just before she was about to step out of her cabin, sword clutched in a white-knuckled grip by her side. What if she couldn't tell her crew from the opposing pirates? The last thing Tenten wanted was to potentially strike down the captain's own men. He didn't want her near the fight to begin with. Would he punish her harshly if he learned she had killed members of his crew? The worry soon dissipated, though, as she took a closer look at the pirates on the deck. Tenten was glad to have been in such close proximity to the pirates despite not being able to work alongside them, because she found she was able to easily discern her crewmates from the enemy. Not only did they look familiar, but they seemed to be much cleaner than the opposing pirates, and Tenten wondered if her captain made sure his men were kept as clean as was possible while on a vessel in the middle of the ocean. With her confidence bolstered, both by remembering her training and by the knowledge that she would be able to know friend from foe, Tenten took her first small steps away from her cabin. For what seemed like an age, though must have only been a minute or two, Tenten just stood with her back to her room, unsure of what to do. She had thought that someone would spot her immediately and rush her, but it was as if she were invisible, the fighting raging around her as though she didn't exist. Her sword was in a death grip and she had to force herself to loosen her hold, remembering that Lee had told her that her attacks should come from her wrist as well as her shoulder, and that if she held on too tightly, she would not be able to defend herself well. Just as Tenten was about to take a step forward into the fray, a head of long dark hair tied in a loose ponytail caught her eye, and she spun in the direction of her pirate captain. Neji was fighting two pirates just a short distance from her position, and as Tenten watched, a third started creeping up behind him. Without thinking, Tenten rushed to the captain's aid. So great was her fear that she wouldn't make it in time, Tenten didn't bother to make sure her footsteps were quiet. A lesson Lee had taught her for when she wanted to sneak up on someone. Instead, her feet slapped against the wooden deck as she sprinted towards Neji, her heart in her throat. He still had not seen the third pirate. But she did make it in time, and she thrust the tip of her sword cleanly through the pirate's heart just as he turned towards her. The man fell to the deck at her feet, and Tenten's eyes widened, bile rising in her throat at the knowledge that she had just killed someone. She stared at the body before her, unable to look away from the blood seeping through the man's shirt and onto the deck below. A shout from Neji forced her to snap out of her sudden horror, and she looked up in time to see one of the two pirates hurtling towards her, sword raised to deliver a killing blow. Tenten barely managed to sidestep the attack, and she fought back, lifting her sword to meet her opponent's. The pirate was ruthless, not once allowing her to go on the offensive, and Tenten was forced to defend herself, her arms quickly tiring against the weight of his blows. He forced her backwards and she soon felt a wall at her back, a sudden jolt of fear coursing through her at the thought that she may not be able to defeat him. Lee wasn't joking when he said my enemies would be ruthless, she thought, trying not to let the fear overtake her. She had to keep a level head if she wanted any chance of winning. Lee's voice suddenly appeared in her head, a lesson he had taught her on their first day of training together. You are small and lithe, he had said, his gaze assessing her from head to toe. Most pirates count on their strength, as opposed to agility when attacking. Your opponents will likely use their strength against you, but you have an advantage of your own. If you can unbalance them, they should become easy pickings. Unbalance her opponent, Tenten could do that. She was agile, having always made sure she kept fit while living with her father at home. If she could duck under one of his attacks, she might be able to throw him off balance enough to get in an attack of her own. Tenten could still see Neji fighting his opponent, but she blocked him out of her thoughts as she renewed her concentration. She fended him off, her arm growing more tired by the second, all the while keeping an eye on any opening he might give her. Just when Tenten thought she couldn't keep up with his attacks, she saw an opportunity. Softening her knees, she waited until her opponent thrust his weapon towards her head before ducking under his arm. He turned, his eyes showing his surprise, but he was too slow to bring his sword arm up in defense as Tenten thrust her own weapon into his side. She pulled her sword out, both cursing her tired arm for weakening what she had hoped to be a killing blow and trying not to feel squeamish at the sight and sound of blood that poured out of his wound. The pirate glanced at his wound before turning a hateful glare upon her. You little bitch. Tenten held her sword up in defense as he advanced once again, but she knew she was too tired to do much more than stand there. For the first time since joining the fight, she regretted not listening to Neji. She had thought herself better than this, but of course she wouldn't be prepared to fight in a proper battle after only 2 weeks of training. Neji had only been trying to protect her, and now she might die, all because she had been stubborn and disobeyed his orders. Just as the panic started to overtake her, the pirate's eyes widened in a look of surprise, and Tenten glanced down to see the tip of a sword protruding from the center of his chest. The pirate slumped lifelessly to the floor, revealing her pirate captain standing over him. Neji was furious as he took a step towards her. I thought I told you to stay in your quarters. If I had done that, you would be dead by now. Despite feeling contrite about disobeying him, Tenten refused to back down. She would not be cowed by him. I appreciate you helping me, but that does not excuse your disobedience. He spoke softly, the low, menacing tone of voice more powerful than if he were yelling. A sliver of fear, and something else, traveled through her at the expression of barely contained fury on his face. She had never seen him look so powerful, and despite the situation they were in, she couldn't help but feel affected by it, in more ways than one. Helping you? I did more than help you, Captain, she shot back. I saved your life. Neji reached up with his free hand to rub his temple, a deep sigh escaping his lips. Yes, fine. I will concede to that. He glanced around at his men, still in the middle of the skirmish, before holding her gaze again. Tenten saw as he struggled to contain his anger, but finally he said, I must continue to help my men. I thank you for your assistance, but I cannot look after you right now. Go back to your cabin, Tenten, until I tell you it is safe. Despite feeling irritated at being ordered around again, Tenten knew better than to argue. She was already exhausted, and she hadn't even been fighting for long. She would just be a liability if she stayed on deck. Tenten's shoulders slumped and she held back a sigh, nodding in acceptance. I will escort you back to your cabin. Do not come out until you are given the all-clear. His glare dared her to disobey, and this time she knew she wouldn't. She had never seen Neji so angry, and she did not want to provoke him further. They walked quietly back to her cabin, Neji on high alert for approaching enemies. Tenten hated to admit it, but she knew she was in need of more training before she was ready for a real fight. That didn't mean she wanted to apologize for disobeying his direct order. She had saved his life, after all. Surely, she deserved some credit for that. Neji didn't say anything as he dropped her off at her cabin, just sent her one more glare before closing the door on her. Tenten wanted to be angry with him for locking her up, but the adrenaline that had been coursing through her during the fight was finally beginning to dissipate. She felt her arms shake and she let her sword fall to the floor, bile rising up in her throat as she replayed what she had done in her mind. Tenten had never killed anyone before today, and although she knew she had protected Neji by doing so, she couldn't stop the feeling of revulsion and remorse from overtaking her. That was a fellow person she had killed, Someone with a life, a family, and she had snuffed their life out in the blink of an eye. Tears sprang to her eyes and she rushed over to the facilities in the room, emptying her stomach's contents into the bucket as she recalled the smell of blood and the sound of bone crunching, of the surprised gasp before the pirate breathed his last breath. Neji's men were quick and efficient as they cleaned the deck after the fight ended. Thankfully, his ship wasn't badly damaged, which meant they would lose little time on their way to Kirigakure. A good thing, since they were already behind schedule. Neji stood on the main deck, directing some of his men to tie up the survivors. They would be sent back to their ship and his men would pillage the vessel for gold, as well as any other valuable items they might find. Unfortunately, Neji had lost a few of his own men in the fight, and he ordered his free crew members to ready them for burial. They would be wrapped up and prepared for a proper sea burial, so that he and his men could show their respect for the dead. After they had started on their way once more, the enemy ship being left behind, its crew tied up on its deck, Neji gathered his men around the main deck, where their fallen comrades were covered and ready to be given to the sea. It had been a long, exhausting morning for them all, one none of them had anticipated, and Neji was ready to give them some reprieve for the afternoon. As Neji began the short funeral service he recited each time they lost men to skirmishes, his thoughts turned to the fiery chocolate-eyed guest who was currently still confined to her rooms. He had contemplated allowing her out for the service but had eventually decided against it. She wasn't part of the crew, had no connections with the fallen men, and Neji knew he would be distracted by her presence if she were here. Besides, he was still mad at her disobedience from earlier, and he wanted her to stay in her quarters until further notice as a form of punishment. After the service ended, the crew helped lift the fallen men into one of the lifeboats and Lee and Naruto climbed aboard, ready to be lowered into the ocean. They rowed out a short distance away from the ship and Neji and his crew watched as they carefully placed each wrapped individual into the water, the silence hanging heavy amongst them. A pang of sadness shot through Neji as he watched the scene, feeling responsible for their deaths as he did every death that happened under his command. One of the men had a wife and small child back home and had agreed to work under Neji's command because he trusted his captain's cause. Now Neji would have to break the sad news to his widow and would have to try and comfort her as he had so many other women before. A life of a pirate was a dangerous one, but his men knew the risks. Most originated from Kirigakure just as he did, and he had known them for years. Their deaths would not be in vain, Neji vowed. Each deployment brought them closer to their goal, and the special cargo on board would go a long way in aiding those in their village for some time to come. When his first mate and Naruto were pulled back up and his crew began to disperse, Neji called for Konohamaru. The cleanup and funeral had taken a long time, and it was now well into the afternoon. His guest had not been giving her midday meal and would surely be hungry by now. Tell the cook to prepare something for Tenten and then take it to her, he instructed the boy as soon as he reached Neji's side. Aye, Captain. And Konohamaru, check on her and report back to me. I want to make sure she is well. The cabin boy nodded and ran to do his bidding, and Neji sighed as he watched the boy go. He could easily check on his guest himself, but Neji knew that would be a bad idea. No doubt they would just get into another argument over what had happened earlier, and Neji wanted to make sure they both had plenty of time to calm down before speaking. Still, Neji knew he owed Tenten an apology for getting angry. Of course, his feelings had been justified, and he would not allow her to do something reckless again, but he begrudgingly agreed that she had helped him. He would make sure she knew he was grateful for that. In the meantime, Neji had plenty to keep himself occupied with. He had a meeting with Lee and Shikamaru to attend, and he needed to check up on his men individually, to make sure they were well and to see if they needed to be looked over by the doctor. The battle had raged on for at least another hour after Tenten was sent back to her quarters, but finally the sounds of fighting disappeared, and she heard the captain ordering his men around again. Tenten wondered what they were doing, whether there was a lot of cleanup work to be done, and if they had lost any of their own men. It had been a long, boring afternoon, with Tenten cooped up in her cabin. She longed to step out onto the deck and do her part to help, but she could still see the furious look on Neji's face when he had escorted her back to her cabin earlier, and she decided not to anger him any further. No doubt he was busy enough as it was without having to worry about her. Instead, she spent the afternoon in her small room where she decided to pen letters to people of her acquaintance, to let those close to her know she was alive and well. Tenten also wanted to write to her father, though even the thought of doing so filled her with dread. But she felt the need to tell him that she was alive, and that she would not be going back home. Never again would that man have a hold over her. A knock at the door indicated the evening meal had been brought to her, and Konohamaru scuttled inside with her tray. Luncheon had never come, and although she had been hungry all afternoon, she hadn't wanted to venture out of her room to find food. Still, she was glad the pirates hadn't forgotten about her completely after the exciting events of the day. Dinner, for ye, miss, the young boy said, setting the tray on her desk where she sat, the bowl of soup sloshed over the side, wetting one of her letters, and Tenten held back an irritated sigh at the sight. It had taken her a long time to write it, and now she would have to start over. Thank you, Konohamaru, she replied, managing a small smile. She knew her frustration stemmed from her exhaustion. Usually, something so little as this wouldn't faze her. But it had been a long, stressful day, and her nerves were frayed almost to breaking point. All she needed was a good sleep, and she would be back to normal. I'm glad to see you unhurt after today's fight. Were there many casualties? Konohamaru's small, grubby hand reached up to pull off his battered cap, and he tucked it under one arm, his eyes downcast. His voice was soft as he replied, only a few. Cap'n held a funeral service this afternoon for him. Tenten tried not to be hurt at the knowledge that she hadn't been there to honor the dead. She would have wished to pay her respects for the fallen pirates, despite not knowing them for long. Why had Neji not asked her to attend? Had the captain not thought of her after the battle? Did he not care for her feelings at all? A thought struck her, causing her heart to sink like an anchor and tears to spring to her eyes. Was she even wanted on this ship? Tenten had been aboard the Crimson Knight as Neji's guest for a little over 2 weeks now, and yet he continued to refuse her the opportunity to spend time with his men, while he himself barely spent any time with her. Maybe, despite his welcoming words 2 weeks ago, the captain was burdened by her presence on his vessel. Perhaps he even wished she had never come aboard. Hot tears burned her eyes, but Tenten was determined not to let them fall. She hadn't cried in years, not even when she was in great physical pain from her father, but it hurt to realize she did not belong anywhere. Tenten had lost her home as soon as she defied her father by fleeing, and now it seemed she didn't belong here either. She had been just starting to enjoy her life at sea, but it seemed she had been getting ahead of herself. Tenten would never be accepted as an equal on a pirate ship. She had been stupid to think she could be. Perhaps it would be best if she left at the next port, despite the captain's warnings that it was a dangerous town. But what would she do there? She had no money, no title. Tenten was a woman alone in the world, and she wasn't as naive as people thought. She knew what men did to women with no protector. Now that she was learning the sword, Tenten had some form of protection, but she also knew it would not help her in all situations. What else could she do, though, except stay in town after they arrive? Neji obviously didn't want her on board. Of that she was certain. And Tenten refused to remain on the Crimson Knight if she was only going to be a burden to the captain and his crew. She hadn't realized she had been in thought for so long, and by the time she shook herself out of her stupor, Konohamaru had long since left and her food had gotten cold. Tenten ate in silence, as she did every meal since she had no company to enjoy, and decided she wouldn't feel sorry for herself any longer. Even if the captain didn't want her here, that did not mean she couldn't make the best of time she had left on board. After eating, Tenten washed her face and changed into warmer clothes before heading outside. After being cooped up in her cabin all afternoon, she wanted to get some fresh air and see the beautiful starry night sky. As she headed to the bow of the ship, Tenten noticed a few crewmates sitting around a small fire pit made of metal. "It's the lass who saved our captain," one of the men said, his words catching her ears. She turned towards the 3 men, her plan to walk past without engaging already foiled. Any other time she would be happy to stop and converse, but despite her efforts to pump herself up, Tenten was still upset, and she didn't feel like company. She sent the men a forced smile, wondering how they knew. The brunette and spiky-haired blonde smiled back at her, but the third person, a blonde-haired man sporting a ponytail, glared at her from his position by the fire. The look sent chills down her spine, and she was grateful when he suddenly stood up and left when she took a step closer to the trio. "Don't worry about him, the spiky blonde, Naruto," Tenten reminded herself, said. "He don't like women on board. Deidara's superstitious like that." Tenten recalled seeing Deidara in passing a few times, and the glares he sent her way during those moments finally made sense. She knew many men were superstitious about women being on boats. She hadn't a clue why, since such a notion seemed ridiculous to Tenten, and wondered how many other crew members felt similar to Deidara. Yet another reason for me to depart at the next town, she thought with an inward sigh. Realizing the 2 pirates were still looking at her, Tenten asked Kiba, the brunette, "How did you know I helped the captain?" She did not think Neji would have told anyone. That would have meant admitting he had been saved by a woman. Sasuke was manning the starboard cannons and saw it. Said ye did good, despite being new. This time, Tenten's smile was real, and she felt her cheeks flush with pleasure at the compliment. "It was a fluke, I assure you. Don't tell the captain, but I was terrified the whole time. It was nothing like my sparring lessons." "Aye, pirates can be vicious bastards," Kiba replied, a teasing grin on his face. Glad ye didn't get hurt though, miss. It's nice, having a woman on board. A sight for sore eyes. I'm sure not everyone thinks so, but thank you, nonetheless. It was nice to be recognized, at least by a few people. The captain especially seems put out with me being here. He even banned me from speaking to his crew. She rolled her eyes, to let the two men know what she thought of that command. Captain told us the same, that we weren't to bother you, but he had his reasons. He didn't want us to scare ya, since such a delicate thing. Tenten couldn't help but laugh at Kiba's comment. That's the first time I've been called delicate. I assure you, I am anything but. The captain obviously doesn't know me very well. She glanced skywards, remembering her reason for coming outside. Thank you for the chat, gentlemen. I was feeling melancholy this evening, but not anymore. I was heading portside, though, so I should continue on my way. Enjoy the rest of your evening. She said goodbye to the two men and continued on, the sounds of the waves lapping against the ship a soothing melody to her ears. It truly was peaceful out at sea when one took out the possibility of running into enemies or suffering through storms. She could easily get used to the tranquility and stillness of the sea. There was no one at the deck when she arrived portside, just her and the great expanse of heavens above. The stars shone brightly, the Milky Way clearly visible above her. Tenten had come out here a few times in the 2 weeks she had free reign of the ship, but she wished she had done it more. It was beautiful out here, and it calmed the disquieting thoughts that were threatening to drown her over dinner. If it were possible for her to remain here on the ocean with nothing but sea and sky surrounding her, she would be happy. I do not believe I gave you permission to distract my men. The voice came out of nowhere and Tenten jumped, spinning around to face the captain. He was wearing a white open-collared shirt tucked into a pair of breeches. The combination of his navy waistcoat and tall, leather boots gave him an air of authority and power, and Tenten couldn't help but notice how infuriatingly handsome he looked. Tenten tried not to bristle at his words. I didn't realize they were busy. Hello to you too, by the way. She turned away from the captain, resolved to ignore him if all he planned on doing was berate her. Her hair was down this evening, and the chocolate locks practically sparkled as they caught the light of the moon, causing her face to glow in an almost ethereal way. Neji hadn't meant to say that, but he had been angry upon seeing her laughing with his men and the words had just tumbled out of his mouth. It was stupid of him, he knew, since he had no claim over her, nor did he want one. He tried to remind himself, but he couldn't help the jealous flare that arose at seeing the three of them enjoying a conversation together. Neji tried to think of something else to say, something that might make her smile, or better yet, laugh, but he could not come up with anything. Why was it so hard for him when it seemed almost effortless for others? While racking his brain for conversation starters, Neji stepped forward so he was next to her and rested his arms on the ship's railing. He knew she ventured out here on occasion to watch the stars, but this was the first time he had chosen to accompany her. He enjoyed standing in this exact spot on nights he wasn't busy, and had found her here on one of her first evenings as his guest, but he hadn't wanted to disturb her. Since then, he knew each time she ventured outdoors after dark, and he made sure one of his most trusted men kept an eye on her as a precaution, since he was aware not everyone was pleased with her presence. He trusted his men to obey his orders, but they were still pirates, and not all of them came from his hometown. Some he had picked up during his career, and he did not know them well enough to trust them completely. Neji knew he was being a coward by keeping his distance, and so had decided to spend some time with her this evening, especially after their last encounter. He wanted to apologize, and he wished to do so soon, before things became too awkward between them. Tent, I'm sorry. They had spoken at the same time, and Neji was surprised to hear the apology leave her lips. He turned to her, eyebrows furrowed. What are you apologizing for? Tenten's dark eyes shone by the light of the stars as she looked at him, and Neji was reminded once again just how beautiful she was. I disobeyed direct orders. Even though I saved your life by doing so, I should have listened to you. I keep grumbling that you don't treat me as part of your crew, but at the same time, I don't act like a crew member. They would have listened to your orders. Neji did not want her to be part of the crew, did not want her to be put in harm's way like the rest of his men, but he was not going to tell her that. Instead, he accepted her apology with a nod. I too owe you an apology. Her large doe eyes widened in surprise at his words, and Neji's lips quirked at the look of utter disbelief on her face. I apologize for yelling at you, Tenten. I understand you must feel frustrated with your situation, and I know much of that frustration is aimed towards me, but I will not put you in a situation where you could get hurt. I was angry that you left your quarters, but I cannot fault you for wanting to help. Thank you for apologizing, Captain. I must admit, though, that I wasn't really prepared for how tough fighting actual enemies would be. I won't interfere again, not until I'm confident that I can truly hold my own. Neji was glad Tenten could be objective with herself, but he would prefer if she never had to fight at all, despite her learning how to. His heart had almost stopped when he saw her on deck, trying to defend herself against such ruthless pirates, and he instantly regretted allowing her to learn the sword. Still, he knew he could not forbid it now, not unless he wanted her to hate him. He would continue to allow her to practice, but he did not think he could stomach her being in a real fight again. We are closing in on Kirigakure, he told her, remembering he did, in fact, have something to say. It is still a few days away, but we will be there by the end of the week. Make sure to have clothes packed to go ashore. He had thought the news might excite her, but instead she seemed to deflate at his words, and he instantly wished he could take them back. Why did she look saddened by the news? Captain, her voice was hesitant, and she glanced his way before fixing her eyes on the darkened ocean before them. What is there to do on Kirigakure? How would someone, let's say a single woman, make a living in such a place? Neji was no simpleton, and his anger flared at what she was implying. Was she so sick of sea life already that she would wish to live in a town which was not safe for a lone woman such as herself? He would not allow it. I assure you, Tenten, that unless you have enough money so you would not have to work, there is no respectable jobs a lady of your stature would be able to find. None at all? I thought perhaps I could stay at a noble's house and teach their children? There are not many nobles in Kirigakure, and among them, most are corrupt. You would not wish to be in their presence. He turned to face her, staring long enough that she had no choice but to stare back at him. Why are you asking these questions, Tenten? I already told you that it is not a respectable town, at least not at the present time. Tenten sighed, breaking eye contact to look at the ocean once again. I just thought it might be easier to take up lodgings there instead of staying on board for a new destination. It has already taken this long just to reach Kirigakure. How long will it take to find another town? I no longer wish to be a burden. Neji frowned at her words. Who said you were a burden? No one, but I can tell when I'm not wanted. You don't let me help with any of the chores. You don't like me talking to any of your men, and you avoid me like I'm the plague. How do you think that makes me feel, Captain? Her voice rose in pitch as she spoke, and Neji could hear the anger and hurt she no doubt tried to keep hidden. What could he say to that? It was not his intention to make her feel that way. He avoided her because he didn't wish his crew to think he had a romantic interest in their guest, and he ordered his men to keep their distance because he did not trust them all to treat her appropriately. See, you don't even have a defense for yourself. I know I don't have money, and my title is all but useless now, but I'm sure I can make a living somehow. And even if it isn't the most respectable town, I can make do there. I've survived with a verbally and physically abusive father for 20 years. I'm perfectly capable of looking after myself. Before he could forbid it, really, did he think she would even listen to him? She turned and left, her back ramrod straight as she walked along the deck back to her quarters. Neji sighed as he watched her go. That had not gone well. Somehow, during the planning stages of her escape, she had failed to think of one important aspect, her period. Her cycle had started sometime in the night, and she had woken up to stabbing pains in her lower abdomen. Having nothing to help ease the pain, Tenten had ripped some of the sheets from her small cot to use, placed them inside her underwear, and then curled up into a ball to try and lessen some of the pain. After tossing and turning for what seemed like hours, Tenten had finally fallen back to sleep, only to be woken by a knocking at her door. Miss? Are ye in there? Konohamaru's voice floated in from outside, but Tenten was in too much pain to call out a reply. She watched light filter into the room as he slowly pushed his way inside, his features creased with worry. Miss Tenten. I'm here, Konohamaru. Tenten managed to sit up and she ran her fingers through her chocolate locks, trying to make herself look somewhat presentable. I brought breakfast for ye, miss. Are ye unwell? Konohamaru placed the tray on its usual place at her desk before walking over to her, his hands clenched together in front of him. Tenten was touched by the worry she saw on his face and sent him a reassuring smile. I'm afraid I'm feeling a little under the weather. Could you please tell the first mate that I won't be able to attend our training session today? Aye, miss. He turned towards the open door but paused, looking back at her with a frown. Not too sick, are ye, miss? Do you want me to fetch the doctor? Despite the pain she was in, Tenten didn't want anyone knowing of her condition. Her period was somewhat manageable back at home, where she had maids and other comforts to help her through the pain of the first few days, but she was currently the only lady on a ship full of pirates. There was no way Tenten was going to give the captain or his men more ammunition to use against her right to be here. No, I'm okay. Thank you though, Konohamaru. I will be fine in a day or two. The young boy still had a crease along his brow, but he nodded before turning to leave once more. He closed the door behind him and Tenten was instantly plunged back into darkness. She should have asked him to light some candles while he was there, since she was in too much pain to get up and light them herself. Tenten groaned as her cramps increased and she lay back down, curling up into a ball once more. As long as she wasn't disturbed for the next few days, she could get through this without anyone figuring out what was wrong. She was late. Neji had been with Shikamaru all morning, listening while his sailing master updated him on changes in the wind direction that might affect their travel time. From his position, Neji had a perfect view of the quarterdeck where his first mate and their guest normally trained, but she was yet to be seen. So too was his first mate, the man not even waiting for his trainee to arrive. The sight, or lack thereof, both worried and frustrated Neji. Where was she? Was she sulking because of his reprimand the previous day? And what was Lee doing, not reporting to him when she failed to arrive? Really, why did it bother him so much? She was her own person. She could do what she wanted. It should not matter to him whether she came out to practice or not. And yet, Neji had to fight the desire to check and make sure she was okay. By the afternoon, Neji still had not seen even a glimpse of her on deck. Tenten normally roamed his ship, pestering his men to see if she could help with anything despite his telling her not to. His worry increased with each passing hour he didn't see her, and by the time his first mate met him for a briefing late in the afternoon, Neji was almost in a full-blown panic. "Lee, have you heard from our guest?" Neji asked, making sure his worry did not show in his tone. "I have not seen her today. Konohamaru told me this morning that she was not feeling well and wished to skip today's lesson." Not feeling well? It was unlikely she would be seasick suddenly, and he did not think she had eaten anything bad. No one else was showing signs of illness. "Why did you not tell me at once after hearing the news?" Lee frowned at Neji's words, and Neji had to force himself to look unbothered despite the increasing agitation he felt. "I did not think it to be that big of a deal. If her illness were bad, Tenten would have asked for assistance." Neji did not like it. Was Tenten truly ill, or was it possible she was avoiding him? Despite their disagreements yesterday, they had both apologized, and Neji thought that would be the end of it. But perhaps she was still upset with him. Should he give her a visit, just to make sure everything was okay? As captain, it was his duty to make sure everyone on his ship was taken care of. Neji dismissed his first mate and started making his way to Tenten's quarters. He would stop by, make sure she was fine, and then be on his way. He would not stay, would not linger, and he certainly would not be distracted by her beauty. Neji knocked on the heavy oak door, paused for an answer, but pushed his way inside when he heard none. "Where have you been all day?" he asked, his tone sharper than he had intended. Lee has been worried. He noted the darkened room around him. None of the lamps had been lit, and he had to wait while his eyes adjusted to the darkness. Why is the room so dark? When she didn't answer, his worry increased. Was something truly wrong with her? "Tenten, where are you?" "Here," came the groaned reply from deeper in the darkness. Neji headed towards the voice, stumbling over something in the blackness and kicking his shin against it. He gritted his teeth to hold back a curse, the pain only adding to his unease. "Why are you in the dark, Tenten? What is wrong?" He finally reached the bed, his eyes just making out the outline of his guest curled into a fetal position on the small cot. "Sorry, I couldn't get up to light them." Her pained voice, plus the fact that it looked as though she had not left the bed all day, had Neji's heart pounding, his worry skyrocketing instantly. "What is wrong? Are you hurt? I will get Shino." The man wasn't a proper doctor, but he was the best they had on board. He turned to leave, but her small, "Wait," made him pause. "It's not something someone can help with," she added weakly. "He can look at you if you are hurting. Do not be stubborn, Tenten. I will call for him." "Captain, it's not like that." But Neji was already at the door, ready to lean out and shout for assistance. "Neji, stop." His name on her lips gave him pause and he turned back to the prone figure curled up in bed. The sight of her, visible now through the crack in the door, sent a protective surge through him, and he had to stop himself from storming out of the room to retrieve Shino at seeing her so ill. "I'm not dying, Neji. I'm on my monthly course." She said it almost hesitantly and it took Neji a few moments to realize what she meant. "Oh." Paused with a foot halfway out the door, Neji was unsure of what to do. How was he supposed to help her with that? Do you need anything?" She hesitated a moment before asking, "Could I please get some water and clean rags?" Immediately, Neji stuck his head out the cabin door and yelled for Konohamaru, who came running across the deck a moment later. "Yes, Captain? Get some water and clean rags from the storage room, and be quick about it." "Aye, Captain." The boy gave a sloppy salute before running off again to do his bidding. Neji wasn't sure what to do now, and he was still half in and half out of the cabin, his mind worrying about what he should say. He did not often have to deal with a woman on her cycle, and his cousin did not usually react like this. She was a fierce, angry beast that scared even him during her monthly courses. "Are you in much pain?" he asked, a little hesitantly, taking a step back inside the room. "Just a little," she replied, her voice betraying her words. "Konohamaru will not be long," Neji assured her. "Would you like something to dull the pain? The cook has a tea that he gives to men with injuries to help with their pain." Tenten shifted on the bed and Neji longed to rush over and help her, to comfort her in any way he could. Instead, he left the door open and walked around the room, lighting lamps so that she could at least see what she was doing. "I already feel like a burden. I don't want to be more of one. The pain will ease in a day or two." Why did she insist she was a burden? Those words rankled him, and he did not know why. "You are no burden, Tenten," he told her, using his authoritative captain's voice so she would not argue. "You should have told me earlier that you were not well instead of suffering in the dark by yourself." Neji knew that if he spent any more time alone with Tenten, his men would start talking. He should make his excuses and flee now, before he did anything he would regret. Instead of bidding her farewell, however, Neji found himself walking towards her once more. The bed she lay in was small, but she looked dwarfed by it, curled up in a ball as she was. Neji sat at the edge of the bed, his fingers reaching out to brush a lock of hair off her damp forehead. "You should have told me, Tenten." His words were a whisper, his fingers featherlight on her skin, and he was pleased when she did not lean away from his touch. "You are busy enough as it is, Captain." Her brown eyes were glazed with pain as she gazed up at him, and Neji's heart twisted at the sight. "Besides, I didn't think you would wish to know. This is not something usually spoken of among the sexes." Neji sent her a glare, but it held no heed to it. It was impossible for him to be mad at her, when all he wanted to do was make her feel better. "I will always have time for you, Tenten. And I do not care if the subject is taboo. I do not want you keeping anything from me." Her gaze softened and she opened her mouth to say something, though what, he would never know. Just as he was leaning down to hear her better, Konohamaru walked through the threshold of the room, supplies in hand. "How is she, Captain?" Neji stood up from the bed so fast he almost tripped over his own feet. He had been caught by one of his men in what could have looked like a compromising position. Neji had only been comforting his guest, but would his crew see it that way? One look at the young boy's face, though, and Neji knew he had not noticed anything. Konohamaru was staring at Tenten, nibbling on his bottom lip, an anxious habit of his. Neji recalled how the boy had been drafted onto his ship and his heart swelled with sympathy for the lad. Naruto had found him in the streets one day, a child just shy of 8 years old. His clothes were old, worn out, and had become too small for him, yet they still managed to hang off his too thin frame. Naruto had immediately taken him home and helped nurse him back to health before asking Neji if he could become part of the crew. Konohamaru's mother had been bedbound with an illness for weeks before it finally took her life, and with no father to look after him, the poor lad had been forced to live on the streets. Neji was sure that if Naruto had not found him that day, Konohamaru would not have survived for much longer. Neji placed a hand on Konohamaru's shoulder, a gesture he hoped was comforting for the lad. "Tenten will be fine. She just needs to rest for a couple of days. There is no need for you to worry." Konohamaru nodded, his eyes finally leaving Tenten to look up at his captain. That's good to hear." After placing the items for Tenten close to her, he gave her a small smile before leaving the room once more. Neji shuffled where he stood, aware that he was once more alone in her room while she lay vulnerable in bed. "Call for Konohamaru whenever you need something," he told her. "I will make sure he is nearby for you." "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your kindness." "Yes, well." Neji cleared his throat, not quite sure how to take the compliment. "I will get the cook to make you some tea." With that, he shut the door behind him. He needed space from this maddening woman before his runaway heart convinced him to stay by her side for the rest of the afternoon. He longed to feel her hair through his fingers once more, to be of some comfort to her during her time of need. Instead, he padded across the deck towards his own cabin. There was much work still to be done, and he could not let himself be distracted, no matter how much he wanted to turn around and go back to her. After receiving the water, rags, and tea, Tenten began to feel better, and was even able to sit up and eat some of the food Konohamaru brought to her for the evening meal. Still, the memory of the captain coming into her cabin and finding her in such a state burned her cheeks. She had hoped no one would check on her despite her discomfort, but that hadn't worked out. And of course, it had to be the captain who visited. Why couldn't it have been Lee, or another deckhand? Having Neji know she was currently on her courses was humiliating. It wasn't something discussed between the sexes. It was barely even a topic discussed amongst women. Despite her embarrassment, Tenten was glad he had come by. If he hadn't, she would still be in excruciating pain, and she wouldn't have anything to help with her flow. For the first time since being aboard the Crimson Knight, Tenten longed for the comfort of her room, her maids, medicine, and the heat rags that usually helped ease her pain. The next morning, she was still suffering, but thankfully less so. She left her bed and lit the lamps around the room, then washed up for the day, cleaning her face and changing the dirtied rags with clean ones. By the time she was finished, a knock sounded at the door and Tenten opened it to let Konohamaru inside with her breakfast. "I brought some more water and rags for ye, miss," he said, placing her food tray on her desk before picking up said items from just outside the door. "I'm glad to see you're up and about today." "Thank you, Konohamaru. I'm sorry I'm taking you away from your other duties to help me like this." He shook his head, a boyish grin overtaking his features. "The captain told me to take good care of ye, and I'm happy to help. Besides," he added, a faint blush covering his cheeks, "I don't want nothing to happen to ye." Tenten was touched that the boy was worried about her and she sent him a smile before replaying the first part of his sentence again. She felt her heart flutter at hearing the captain had specifically asked that she be taken care of, even though the knowledge confused her. At times he seemed so apathetic towards her, and yet there were other instances, like yesterday in her room, where she was certain he cared for her. Tenten wished she could understand what was going on in that head of his, so she knew where she stood with him. "You will have to thank the captain for me, then," she said, walking over to the desk. Glancing down, Tenten noticed something new amongst the array of food normally on her tray. "What's this?" Konohamaru glanced at the item she was pointing at before sending her another grin. "The cook said Cap'n ordered it to be made, specially for ye. It's a sweet cake." He scuffed his shoe against the wooden floor and added, almost sheepishly, "I'm a little jealous. I never had a sweet cake before." For the second time that morning, Tenten felt her heart flutter. She wondered how Neji knew women often craved sweet things during their cycle. The fact that he had such a thing made specifically for her warmed her heart. She sat at the table and took the fork, using it to cut the sweet treat in half. "How about we share it, then?" she said to the young boy, whose eyes widened at her suggestion. "Really, miss?" He looked so excited. Tenten couldn't stop the smile from spreading across her lips. "Really? Here, you have this piece." He held out his grubby hands and she frowned. "Go wash up first. You shouldn't eat with dirty hands, it could make you sick." Konohamaru ran to do her bidding, washing his hands in her water basin before racing back to her side. He presented her with freshly clean hands, and she placed the bigger half in them. He bit into the treat and groaned, a look of pure joy on his face. Tenten nibbled on her half, impressed that the cook could come up such a treat despite being in the middle of the ocean. She would have to make a special trip to the kitchens to thank him personally for the treat. After they had both finished eating the sweet cake, Konohamaru left her to get a start on his other duties. Tenten finished her breakfast in silence and sipped on the pain-dulling tea, absently wondering just what ingredients were in it. She hoped it was nothing that could harm her body, but she wasn't worried enough not to drink it. Her pain was worsening again, and she didn't want to spend another day confined to her bed. Still, even after the pain began to subside, Tenten decided to stay indoors. She still had letters she needed to write, and she wanted them finished before they arrived at Kirigakure so she could mail them. Besides, she was still embarrassed about the captain knowing the reason behind her illness and she didn't quite know how to act if she were to run into him so soon. Neji made his way across the deck, his leather boots barely making a sound on the wooden surface. He was nervous, which was ridiculous. He was the captain of a pirate ship who had overturned many vessels, both pirates and naval alike. So why did one woman make him so apprehensive? His guest had been absent yesterday, but he was relieved to have seen her out and about today. She forewent her sword training, but he observed her and his first maid talking for quite a while during the morning. It was evening now, and the moon was full tonight, the light allowing the crew member in the crow's nest to have a good view of the ocean around them. They would be docking at Kirigakure early tomorrow and Neji wanted to let his guest know, to make sure she was prepared for their departure. Many of his men had their own homes in Kirigakure, and those that didn't, would stay at the local hotel for the duration of their shore leave. Neji knew he should pay for Tenten to stay there as well, but he found he could not stomach the thought of not knowing how she was faring, while he was safe in his home with his family. He knocked on her door, waiting until she let him into her quarters. Neji knew that the nerves rolling through him weren't just to do with seeing her. He was anxious about telling her she would be staying with him, with his family, during their visit. Neji wanted to make sure she was close, and, despite knowing he had other options he should choose from, Neji knew he would not be at ease if she were anywhere but by his side. The first glimpse of her, hair framing her face and those bright, chocolate eyes blinking up at him, stole his breath, and it took him a few moments to regain his sanity. She smiled at seeing him and opened the door, allowing him into her room. Neji wondered if she knew that with each smile she offered him, his resolve to stay away from her cracked a little more. He was starting to wonder why he was doing that. Why did he care what his crew thought? He was the captain. He could do anything he damn well wanted. But still, Neji would never want to make Tenten feel uncomfortable, and so he hardened his resolve once more as he stepped into her quarters. "For what do I owe this pleasure, Captain?" Tenten asked, her smile still brilliant on her face. "We will be reaching Kirigakir tomorrow morning. Make sure you are prepared to go ashore." Oh, the news seemed to excite her for a moment before she frowned, and Neji wondered what she was thinking to make such an expression mar her lovely face. Is something wrong? Was she still thinking of staying in the village, despite his express command that she was not to do so? He had family in the village, yes, and much of his crew had family there, but they were under his protection, and he knew no one would dare touch them. Neji was aware that he could do something similar for the woman before him, but he did not want to. The thought of her staying in such a place, while he was off at sea, made him uneasy, until he could make sure Kirigakir was safe, something he was currently trying to make possible. He did not want her living there. Even staying with his family for a long period of time was out of the question. She had quickly gotten under his skin, despite his attempts to stop such a thing from happening, and Neji would only feel at ease if she were by his side, safe and cared for. Having no family of her own to take care of her, it was both his duty and his privilege to step up to the task. And Neji would not take that duty lightly. "Captain, are you listening to me?" Her voice penetrated his thoughts, and his eyes focused on her features again. How Neji longed for her to call him by name instead of his title. But again, he did not wish to make her uncomfortable, so he kept the request to himself. "My apologies. What did you say?" "I asked if you knew where I will be staying." She shuffled from foot to foot, an embarrassed flush infusing her cheeks. "I won't be able to afford a hotel." The desire to reach out and touch her pinkened cheeks was almost overwhelming, and Neji had to clasp his hands behind his back to stop himself from doing just that. "There is no need to worry about money. Everything is sorted." Her eyes widened slightly at his words, but she nodded, a small smile gracing her lips. They lapsed into silence, Neji not able to bring himself to tell her just yet what he had in mind. An inquisitive expression came over her. "Can I ask you something?" Of course. Why did that question make his heart race? "I've been wondering this for a while, and I hope I don't sound rude asking. Why don't you sound like a pirate?" Neji raised a surprised brow, not expecting that question. "Are you disappointed?" "What? No, but I am curious. You sound like you had a good education, so I was wondering how and why you became a pirate." He should have been expecting this. He had expected it, but it still caught him off guard. Neji was not sure why the question made him anxious, since he was sure she would not judge him for the truth, but once again, he wasn't quite ready to tell her. At least for one more night, Neji wanted to enjoy Tenten's company like this, without the barriers that will inevitably come on the morrow. Instead of answering her question, he replied with, "You will know soon enough." She tilted her head slightly, her brows pulled together in an adorable frown. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he agreed. He stepped backwards, towards the door. "We will be disembarking just after dawn. Be ready." "Right. Thank you, Captain. I'll be ready." Opening the door, he gave his guest one last glance, unable to stop his eyes from roving over her features. "Good night, Tenten." "Good night, Captain." Her soft, parting smile stayed with him, even after he fell asleep that evening, and he dreamed of nothing but her face the whole night. Nerves coursed through Tenten as she prepared to disembark the ship for the first time in a month. She hadn't realized how emotional she would get after seeing land for the first time in so long, but at her first glimpse of the town in the distance that morning she had burst into bittersweet tears. It wasn't that she missed her life back home, but she realized she did miss the little things. The feel of sand under her feet, of seeing flowers blooming, dogs running around, and the smell of freshly baked goods early in the morning. Now, as she gripped the handle of her bag tightly with both hands, she wondered what this new town would be like. Neji had said it was a violent place to live, and she wondered how he knew that. Would it be so unsafe that she wouldn't be able to walk around by herself? Would he refuse her the right to go where she wished? God, she hoped not. Just the thought tightened her chest. It was what her father had done, and she had to sneak out of her house just to go downtown. Tenten had hated being locked up in her own home, and she didn't think she would be able to go through that again. Ready? Lee appeared beside her, a smile on his face. He seemed excited, and she wondered if he was one of the crew members who had family in the village. Yeah, I think so. It will be nice to be on solid ground again. Just be careful. You might be unsteady at first, especially since this was your first time at sea. She thanked him for the advice, and he stepped away, ordering some of the deckhands to be more careful with the chests they carried. She wondered just how bad it could be, going from sea to land. She had seen many seamen step off their ships at the port back home, and none of them seemed to have any trouble with the transition. Maybe Lee was just trying to mess with her. But as she took her first step on solid ground, her legs gave out from beneath her and she would have fallen to the pavement if a firm grip to her arm hadn't pulled her back to her feet. She flushed, turning her head to see the captain beside her, his lips quirking and an amused glint in his eyes. Careful, he warned, still holding onto her arm. It will take some time before you get used to walking on land again. Tenten flushed even harder and she ducked her head to avoid his gaze. I thought Lee was just joking about that. No, a chuckle rumbled from his chest, causing her heart to stumble over itself. That was the first time he had laughed in her presence, and she couldn't help but notice what a nice laugh it was. You will get used to the transition with time, but for your first few departures, it would be best to take extra care. Her legs did feel especially weak, and she worried that she would fall to the pavement as soon as Neji let her go. She felt like a newborn fawn trying to walk for the first time, and if that wasn't embarrassing enough, seeing the amused stares of the pirate crew made her face burn even hotter. Konohamaru, the captain barked, and the young pirate ran up to them almost instantly. Take Tenten's bag and bring it to the house. Oh no, you don't have to, Tenten said as Konohamaru tried to tug her bag from her hands. She glanced at the captain. I can carry it myself. Neji didn't pay her any attention, just stared down his subordinate. Hurry up. Aye, Captain. The boy tugged until Tenten let go of her bag. He sent her a quick grin and then left the couple, running to catch up with his crewmates. Why did you do that? Tenten asked, glaring up at the man beside her. Instead of answering, Neji tucked her arm into the crook of his elbow. Come, he said, and started walking. Tenten had no choice but to follow him, lest she be pulled along. Her legs still felt wobbly beneath her and she appreciated the captain's assistance, but she did not like being weak in front of him. They walked through town, with his crew dispersing around him to their respective homes, and she supposed, families, while they continued along the path. Konohamaru walked ahead of them, carrying her bag, while some of the other crew members carried chests between them, and she wondered if they were all heading in the same direction. At first glance, the town looked normal. People went about their business in the usual, orderly fashion just as she was used to seeing in her town. But upon closer inspection, Tenten could see signs of anxiety in the people she passed. Civilians eyed each other warily, holding their precious belongings, both material possessions as well as children, close to their side. There was minimal banter between those running the stalls and the buyers, which was strange to see. Everyone back home knew each other, and Tenten could easily recall them chatting and laughing with one another whenever she snuck into town. Some of the people they passed looked at Neji and his crew with disdain, but most waved to them, and a few even bowed as the captain walked past, greeting him as though he was of a high station. Tenten frowned at the display and tilted her head to give him a questioning look, but he didn't return her gaze, nor did he turn his gaze to the people on the street. Naruto, on the other hand, was waving and greeting everyone he came across, and Tenten realized he must live in this town as well. His cheerfulness, so unlike that of the average pirate, made her smile, and Tenten began to relax a little. Captain? How much further? You can let me go now. She noticed people not only watching the pirates, but her as well, their eyes training onto where her hand rested against his arm. We will be there soon, he replied, but refused to relinquish his grip. Why are people bowing when you walk past? He only replied with, soon, while tightening his hold on her and picking up his pace once again. Soon couldn't come fast enough, but after a couple of turns, the small group stopped in front of a tall gate with a dirt path leading up to a large, almost mansion-like building in the distance. Tenten's jaw dropped at the scene. It was even bigger than her place back home, and she thought they were just stopping for a short break before continuing, until they started walking along the path towards the house. Are we staying at a friend's house? She asked the captain. His lip twitched into a brief smile and he glanced down at her. Soon, Tenten. She sent him a glare. Is that your favorite word today? Before Neji could answer, Tenten saw people running from the building towards their small group. She tensed for a moment until she noticed their smiling faces, and before long they were being surrounded by what she guessed were servants. Welcome home. My lord, a tall man with black hair and equally dark eyebrows declared in an overly loud voice, bowing towards Neji. Those behind him made a similar motion, and Tenten was taken aback by the display. Lord. Neji was a lord. But he was a pirate. How could he be a lord as well? Tenten managed to free her arm from Neji's grip and she took a step away from the group as his staff circled around him, welcoming him home with excited voices. His eyes found hers and he refused to look away, so Tenten broke their gaze, turning her back on him to give herself a moment's reprise. She could feel her heart beating wildly in her chest at this revelation. She knew different islands and towns dictated their people differently. Her town had her father as the mayor instead of lords of varying kinds, but she hadn't expected to have found herself in the presence of a nobleman. Not once had that thought even come into her mind, and Tenten began to rethink everything she had done and said in front of him. Tenten. Neji's voice cut through her panicked thoughts and she spun to find his eyes on her, his lips pulled down in a concerned frown. Are you well? Ah, yes. I'm fine. Should she address him as Lord, now? Tenten had no idea how she was supposed to be acting. Should she bow? Curtsy? Kiss his ring? Neji obviously didn't believe her, going by the way his frown deepened as he continued to watch her inner struggles. He held out his arm once more for her, and she noticed how his staff swung their gazes between the two of them, their eyes widening in surprise at the display. Reluctantly, Tenten stepped forward to take his arm again, and together they walked towards what she realized must be Neji's home. Already she was feeling overwhelmed by the situation and Tenten wondered how many other surprises were waiting for her that day. It is good to see you, cousin. Hinata smiled as they stepped into the front entrance, Neji's staff automatically dispersing to take bags to their respective rooms. Neji was left in the bright entryway with his cousin and his charmingly confused guest. Naruto and his fellow crewmates followed them in, carrying the cargo for the townsmen between them. I am sorry for being away so long, Neji replied. He would have his men carry the cargo to his office shortly, but he knew his cousin-in-law would want to greet his wife first. And that he did. Naruto practically pounced on Hinata, picking her up with a huge grin and planting a kiss on her lips in front of everyone. Hinata flushed a dark red, but she was smiling as well, and she greeted her husband with whispered words and gentle touches. Neji glanced down to see his guest's reaction, and almost snorted at the slack-jawed look on her face. Neji understood she must be feeling overwhelmed and decided it would be best for her to retire for a while, so that she could collect herself. He would find her later and tell her everything. For now, though, he had important work to do. Take the chests into my office, he ordered the men. Guy, he said, turning towards his valet. Send word for Lee to see me as soon as possible. Yes, sir. Guy boomed, his large grin almost splitting his face in two. Neji knew that as soon as the two were alone the older gentleman would crush his bones in a hug, having been almost 3 months since his last visit home. Neji's longest stint away from home. Sakura, Neji called to his head maid. The pinkette curtsied in response, but he didn't miss the way her face fell at the knowledge that her secret lover, or so she thought, anyway, wasn't there. Take Tenten to one of the guest rooms and make sure she is comfortable. She will be staying with us for the duration of our visit. Of course, sir. Sakura smiled at Tenten and beckoned their guest to follow her. Instead of following straight away, Tenten turned to him, the unmistakable question burning in her eyes. He gave her a reassuring smile and reluctantly let go of her arm. He would rather escort her himself, but he had to keep up appearances, and until he was certain of what he wanted from his feisty chocolate-haired guest, and what she wanted from him in return, he would not give his staff reason for gossip. We shall talk soon, he promised. Then he followed his men down the hall towards his study, where he would wait for his first maid to arrive. They had much planning to do. It's so nice to have another woman around the house, the maid, Sakura, Neji had called her, was saying, glancing back at Tenten every few steps. Her smile was wide, and Tenten got the feeling she was a genuinely nice person. There's only a few girls on the staff, and then there's Lady Hinata, but otherwise we're overrun with men. It will be a breath of fresh air having you join our ranks. Lady Hinata is the captain's, Lord Neji's cousin, Tenten asked, stumbling over her words. She no longer knew how she was supposed to address him. Sakura nodded. Yes, but they're practically siblings. The two grew up in this house together. The late Earl was Hinata's father, and he raised the 2 children by himself after a plague swept through the village and killed his wife, younger daughter, brother, and sister-in-law. He was helped greatly by Guy and a horde of other staff, of course. But because of that, the late Earl always treated Neji as a son. Tenten was barely listening, not since Sakura had called Neji an Earl. Her legs turned to jelly, and she nearly stumbled over her own feet, so shocked was she at the news. Neji was a bloody earl. Compared to him, Tenten was practically a commoner. Her title as a lady was valid only because her father had become mayor of their small town. If it weren't for her father's position, of which he had received when she was only a small child, Tenten was sure she would have been like any other peasant child around the town. When she had first met Neji, she had thought herself above him, both in station and decency. As time went by, though, Tenten began to forget their differences, and had even wondered what it would be like to live the pirate life full-time, if it meant she would be able to stay by his side. Now she realized with a rising horror that Neji was light years out of her league. "Are you all right, miss?" Sakura was eyeing her with concern, and it was only then that Tenten realized they had stopped in front of a door. "I'm fine. Sorry, I'm still recovering from my newfound land legs." When the pinkette gave her a confused frown, Tenten said sheepishly, "It was my first time at sea, and I'm still getting used to walking on solid ground again." "Oh, well that's understandable." Sakura led her into a large, fine room, much finer than her room back home. "I have never been out to sea, but I have heard it takes some time to acclimatize each time you reach land." The pinkette turned to Tenten then, her smile turning secretive. "So, of what do we owe the pleasure of having you here, miss? Are you a special friend of our lord's?" Tenten felt her cheeks redden at the maid's question. What? No, I'm just a guest." Why did the room suddenly feel hot? "And please," Tenten added, desperate to change the subject, "call me Tenten." "I couldn't do that. Lord Neji wouldn't be happy." "Then, just when we're alone, at least. Please, Sakura. I'm quite sick of titles." "Then, Tenten," she maid said with a smile, "I would like to officially welcome you to the Hyuga estate. I hope you enjoy your stay." Neji and his 4 closest friends sat around his office, discussing the next step in their plan. "We will have to divvy up the medicine and give to the men, so they can distribute it to the people evenly," Neji told them. "We were gone longer than expected this time, and I do not want any more delays." "Aye, Captain. I agree," Lee replied. "The town of Kirigakure used to be prosperous, many years ago. But ever since the new Duke arrived in town, everything deteriorated. The Duke was a snake, demanding more tax than was needed on the people, and refusing them healthcare unless they paid an exuberant amount of money. And if they didn't pay, the Duke had people he used to encourage them." Being an earl, Neji felt it was his duty to care for the people himself. His uncle had been aloof when it came to the commoners, but Neji and his cousin had always had a soft spot for the people. After the Duke came to town, bringing poverty and violence with him, Neji and Hinata had decided to take it upon themselves to help. Thus Neji's life as a pirate was started, pillaging other ships, both pirate and merchant, in order to gain enough coin and medicine for his people. A knock sounded at the door a moment before Hinata entered, carrying a tray laden with tea and biscuits for the men. Naruto was immediately on his feet, taking the tray from her and directing his wife into his now vacant chair. "Ye have maids for this," Naruto told her as he placed the tray in front of Neji on his desk. "Ye don't need to always bring tea in for us." Hinata just smiled warmly at the blonde. "I know, but I enjoy doing this. Besides, I wanted to say a proper hello to everyone." Despite her words, Hinata looked pointedly at Neji, and he knew she was silently asking about the surprise guest he had brought home. He pretended not to understand the look, instead taking a long sip of his tea. "It's good to see ye looking well, Lady Hinata," Kiba said with a grin. "Thank you, Kiba. But please, when will you just call me Hinata?" Kiba shook his head and eyed Neji. "I don't want the lord of the house yelling at me again. I get enough of that on the ship." "My apologies. I am still trying to get my cousin to relax a little when he is home." Neji's ire rose at her words. "I am relaxed. If I allow some to be lax with their respect, then others will demand the same. This assures that everyone remains respectful." Hinata sent him a long-suffering look but dropped the subject. They had argued that topic multiple times already, and she was aware he would not budge on the matter. Instead, she asked the question he had been worried about since he arrived home. "It is not like you to bring someone home with you, my lord. Who is this woman that you would deem it appropriate to share your house with her?" "I found her hiding on the Crimson Night and have allowed her passage as a guest." He ignored how her eyebrows rose in surprise. "I did not want her to room at an inn by herself. My house was the only logical place for her to stay while we are ashore." "You were very attentive towards her when you arrived." Hinata gave him a knowing smile that Neji also ignored. "I do not remember the last time you acted like so towards a woman." Neji did not want to answer questions about Tenten. His attention was needed with the medicine for his people, and he did not want his cousin's questions to distract him more than he already was. He sent her a glare. She is a guest and I want her to be comfortable. Now, if you are done saying hello, we have much to discuss. Of course. Apologies, my lord. She moved towards the door, an amused smile on her lips, but when she glanced at him again, her smile was warm and genuine. It really is good to have you home, cousin. You have been missed. Neji returned the smile with a small one of his own. It was good to be home. It was late in the afternoon when Tenten finally ventured out of her room. After luxuriating in a proper bath for the first time in weeks, she had promptly crashed on the soft bed, the sway of the ocean still present when she closed her eyes to sleep. Now, her rumbling stomach pushed her to leave her room in search of food. She meandered through the hallway to the large, winding staircase, and tiptoed down the marble floor until she reached the entrance again. Tenten glanced around, wondering where the kitchen would be. Thankfully, she didn't have to think too hard, as Sakura soon came around the corner and found her. It's nice to see you up and about, miss. The pinkette said with a smile. Can I help you with anything? I was just looking for the kitchen. Tenten felt nervous in this big unfamiliar home, and her thoughts once again turned to her pirate captain, Earl. She corrected herself, wondering what he was up to. Would she even see him, now that he was back home? No doubt he would be busy with his duties, and the thought of her not seeing him left her feeling hollow inside. What if he forgot about her now that he was home, and she didn't see him again until they departed? Here, Sakura said, breaking Tenten out of her sudden thoughts, let me show you. Tenten followed Sakura down the hallway until they came to a large door, as intricately decorated as all the others she had come across so far. The kitchen is through here. Dinner will be ready shortly, but should I ask the cook to make something for you? I'll just have a snack, then. She was starving. A small snack before dinner wouldn't hurt. Very well, miss, that is Lady Tenten to you. The loud voice startled the two women, and they both spun around to see Neji standing in the hallway behind them, his glare trained on the pink-haired maid. Tenten noticed that he had changed from his pirate outfit of breeches and a plain white shirt, and he now wore clothes befitting his title. A suit, complete with a vest and cravat, adorned him, and his long hair had been washed and was cascading down his back, for once untied. Tenten could easily admit that he looked handsome, though she did miss seeing him in his pirate attire. Apologies, my lord, Sakura bowed low, her face flushing with embarrassment. I meant no disrespect. That's not necessary, really. Tenten didn't feel comfortable being addressed so formally, and she didn't want Sakura to be reprimanded because of her. You will be addressed by your proper title, Neji said, his glare landing on her briefly before finding the maid once more. I'm barely a lady anymore, Tenten argued. I think running away from home would negate my standing in society. The look Neji sent her was final. While under my roof you will be addressed appropriately. If I hear any of my staff addressing you disrespectfully, they will be punished. Tenten wanted to object to such a ridiculous demand, but she knew it would be fruitless. How was one supposed to argue with an earl? Instead, she shot him a glare, so he knew just how she felt about his request. No wonder he had been such a great pirate captain. Authority dripped off Neji as he stood before them, as though no one would ever dare to even think of defying him. He was an earl through and through, and the sight was even more commanding than when he was dressed in his captain's garb. Neji's lip quirked upwards at her display of defiance, but he schooled his features almost instantaneously. Are you busy, my lady? Not really. I was hoping to get something to eat, though. Sakura, get a plate ready and bring it to my office. Lady Tenten and I have some things to discuss. Things? What things? Sakura bowed and turned away to do his bidding, uttering another apology. Neji turned to face Tenten and beckoned her to follow him before walking down the hallway. She trailed behind the earl, nerves knotting her stomach. The heavy door clicked shut behind the couple and Neji indicated for his guest to take the chair opposite his desk. He walked around the desk and sat down, his eyes steadily watching her. She looked nervous, her gaze darting around the darkened room, her hands fidgeting with the material of her dress. Neji himself was feeling unsettled, both by her proximity as well as the news he was planning on telling her, but he refused to show evidence of such nerves. His gaze traveled over her, enjoying the sight of her once more in a dress instead of the pirate's frock she wore on his ship. She truly was lovely, with hair and eyes the color of warm chocolate and lips just begging him for a kiss. This was not the time to marvel at her beauty, though, and Neji tried to shake the thoughts from his mind. He knew he was attracted to her, but Neji also knew he could not, should not, do anything about it. She was planning on settling down in a small town, and Neji refused to let it be Kirigakure, especially in its current state, if he were not here to make sure she was kept safe. "Are your rooms satisfactory?" he asked, the silence having stretched on so long it had become awkward. Her head snapped up at the sound of his voice, but she immediately dropped her eyes, fixing them on his desk instead. Neji tried not to be annoyed at the action, but he supposed she must be feeling confused. He had not given her a heads up about his true personage, and she must have gotten a shock after everything that happened since their arrival. "They're lovely, my lord," she replied in a soft voice so unlike her. Neji did not like the meek tone of her voice, nor did he like her calling him Lord, or Captain for that matter. He desperately wanted her to call him by name, but he did not want to make her feel even more uncomfortable by asking such a request, especially in this new environment. "What did you wish to speak to me about, my lord?" Right. He had brought her in here to tell her everything, not to gawk at her. "I apologize that you had to find out about my status the way you did. I owe you an explanation, and I also wish to tell you why I started pirateering." With that, Neji told her everything. Sleep evaded Tenten that evening, the events of her conversation with Neji playing and replaying in her mind. She was still trying to come to terms that Neji was an earl, a man of standing in society, and not a lowly pirate whom he pretended to be, and now she had more information to ponder upon. Instead of the brigand she had first believed him to be, Neji was an earl who cared about the people of his town. Despite his status, though, he didn't have enough power to make sure the commoners were properly cared for, not while the Duke remained in control of the people. Tenten understood bad leadership only too well, having had a father who kept his people under his thumb. But where Tenten had been unable to help the ones in her village, Neji was doing everything in his power to help his townspeople. He had gotten a crew together, most from this very island and whom he trusted implicitly, and begun plundering other pirate ships for gold and other spoils to distribute amongst the poor back home. Not only did Neji make sure his people were cared for monetarily, but he also looked after their physical ailments as well. Tenten hadn't been aware until he told her, but Neji and his men had smuggled medicine in for the people, who normally didn't have access to it unless they paid the Duke an exuberant price for such care. From what Neji said, the Duke was a horrible, selfish man, who cared only for himself. While the people in town struggled from day to day, he lived in luxury, his wealth only growing larger with the ridiculous tax he expected the people to pay regularly. Neji himself helped the people with his own funds as much as he could, but with a household to care for as well, he had been forced to look elsewhere for money, hence the reason he became a pirate. Lying in bed now, Tenten couldn't stop the warmth that spread through her chest as she thought of the Earl's kindness. She had seen a portion of that kindness firsthand with the way he had treated her on board, of course, but to find out how much he cared for others and what lengths he would go to help them, Tenten felt herself falling for him a little more. Which was crazy. There was no way anything could happen between them, him, an earl. Her, barely even a lady anymore. He would have to marry someone of equal or higher status than him, for Tenten would not be able to bring anything profitable into a marriage. Tenten shook her head, a blush turning her face scarlet in the dark room. Where had that thought come from? Marriage? Rolling over, Tenten forced herself to stop that train of thought. It would be dangerous to ponder over a life that was out of reach for her. Neji's cousin came to mind, and a smile ghosted over Tenten's lips. Upon leaving his study, she had been briefly introduced to Hinata, and though they hadn't spoken much, Tenten knew she was just as kind as her older cousin. Hinata was a quiet sort of lady, but she had such a warm smile and genuine kindness about her that Tenten had instantly felt at ease. It was strange for Tenten to think that such a soft-spoken woman was married to such an exuberant, energetic pirate, but they had seemed very much in love upon first arrival, and Tenten was happy for them. Despite herself, Tenten once again thought of her conversation with the Earl. A flush warmed her cheeks as she remembered something he had said towards the end of their meeting. She knew it should have annoyed her, especially because of her fears earlier in the day, but she only felt cared for, even if the words were said out of a sense of duty and responsibility. "You are welcome to visit the village," he had told her, his beautiful pale eyes fixed on hers, "but only if you have an escort. I would take you into town myself, but I am afraid I will be very busy over the next few days and will not have adequate time to do so. For your own safety, I ask that you do not leave the house by yourself." His expression had been serious, and she knew better than to argue with him. "Is it truly that dangerous out there?" she had asked instead. "As much as I try and help those in need, violence has gotten worse in recent months and I do not trust some of the men in town to behave themselves in the presence of a beautiful woman. I will not risk your safety, Tenten." He had called her beautiful. Tenten had felt her cheeks heat at his words, and even now as she lay in bed her heart warmed with pleasure at their conversation. It took Tenten a long time to fall asleep, and when she finally nodded off, she dreamt of a pale-eyed pirate who wore fine clothes and called her beautiful while they explored town together. Breakfast was lively the next morning, with Naruto chatting happily to his wife at the opposite end of the table. The blonde may have been born a commoner, but he was now a lady's husband, which elevated his status. Neji was happy Naruto and Hinata had found each other and was glad that being cousin-in-law to an earl had not changed the blonde's personality. Neji picked at his food, eating as slow as possible while simultaneously eyeing the door to the dining room. He had asked Sakura to wake his guests so she could eat with them, but she was still not here. Maybe he should go check to see if she was okay. Just when he was about to stand up, the doors opened and Tenten floated in, looking positively enchanting in a simple peach-colored gown. He scrambled to stand in greeting, almost knocking over his glass in his haste, and watched as she made her way to the table. Before she could think about where to sit, Neji pulled out the chair beside his, indicating for her to sit. She did so, a pretty flush climbing her neck, and he pushed the chair in before sitting back down. Neji called for a plate to be brought out for Tenten, but he could not bring himself to look away from her. He knew he was in trouble. He was supposed to be concentrating on the medicine he needed to distribute, not on the woman next to him. But despite it all, Neji could not bring himself to stop. Now that they were away from his ship, his crew, Neji wanted to spend more time with her. As much time as he could before they set sail again. "Is there anything you wish to do today?" he murmured, not wanting to disturb the other couple at the other end of the table. Hinata was bad enough, with all her questions about what his intentions were with his guest. If Naruto were to hear their conversation, Neji would never hear the end of it. She glanced up at him, and Neji was momentarily lost in her eyes. They hid a sea of wealth within them, and Neji would gladly drown in her gaze if she let him. "I haven't really thought about it yet." He stopped the smile that threatened to spread across his face at her words. "I could show you around the grounds. The gardens are quite beautiful this time of year." Neji was waiting for his crew to arrive, but that would not be until later. He had some time in the morning, and he wanted to spend it with her. The smile she sent his way almost stole his breath, and his gaze zeroed in on her lips, mesmerized by them. "That would be lovely, my lord." Again, it was at the tip of his tongue to tell her to call him by his Christian name, but with a glance at the other couple, he decided against it. If they overheard his request, they would pester him with questions, and he did not yet have the answers to give. Instead, he nodded, keeping his sudden excitement in check. "We shall go after breakfast, then, before it gets too hot." Neji enjoyed another one of her smiles before her food came and distracted her. Never mind. He would be able to spend the morning alone with her. Neji wondered how many times he could get her to smile and decided he would try to do so often. They had so often clashed on the ship and she had barely smiled for him there. Neji was determined to make up those smiles now, where they could spend more one-on-one time together. Gravel crunching underfoot was the only sound Tenten heard as she walked beside the earl. They were taking a turn about the gardens, and though said gardens were beautiful indeed, Tenten's entire body seemed to be humming with nerves. She racked her brain for a topic of conversation, as it did not seem as though Neji would be contributing anytime soon. Anything at all, to stop this awkward silence from continuing for even a second longer. "I had not realized Naruto was married," she noted, having been observing the couple during breakfast that morning. "And it never occurred to me that he was a man of status." She had seen him enough times on the ship and his speech was never one that could be classified as higher class. Neji's movements never slowed, but she got the impression that he wasn't expecting that question. There was a long pause before he replied, "That is because he is not." Naruto had little means or prospects growing up, despite his parents' best efforts to help him succeed in life. "Oh, then how did he and Hinata get to know each other?" Tenten didn't want to be rude, but usually the social classes didn't mix, and she rarely heard of a lady marrying a commoner. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a small smile touch the earl's lips. "My cousin was in town when she was accosted by two men. Naruto came to her rescue and Hinata has been smitten ever since." "And you do not disapprove of their match, despite their difference in status?" "No, unlike my uncle, I do not care about class or status. If someone has the means to help others, then I believe they should do so. Naruto has proven himself more than worthy of my cousin, so I had no qualms about approving their match." Tenten was pleasantly surprised by his words. There weren't many out there that didn't define people by their status in society, and it was refreshing to learn Neji was impartial in that way. She should have realized earlier, though, with the way he strove to help those in his village because he had the means to do so. He was so different to her father, who never befriended anyone unless they would be able to help him in some way. They lapsed into another silence, but this one was comfortable, and Tenten was content to continue in silence while she mulled on this new piece of information. After a time, A deep sigh came from the man beside her, drawing her gaze. She was only supposed to glance at him, but his profile caught her attention and she found herself studying the Earl more closely than she meant to. Neji's head turned towards her and their gazes locked together. Tenten was unable to look away, though her cheeks heated with embarrassment at having been caught staring. She marveled once again at the pale shade of his eyes. She had never seen eyes that color before, and Tenten wondered how far back in his genealogy such a trait went, and if it came from his mother or his father. Tenten, his sudden use of her name startled her, as did the accompanying clearing of his throat. Yes, my lord? Had she done something to upset him? Did he disapprove of her questioning Naruto and Hinata's relationship? Or was it her staring that had been upsetting for him? Neji stopped walking, forcing her to do the same, a serious expression on his face. After a deep breath he said, I wish for you to call me Lord Neji. Both Neji and Tenten spun around at the new voice. Neji's valet, Guy, was running down the path towards them, waving his arms to get their attention. He stopped in front of them and stooped over, placing his hands on his knees as he caught his breath. My lord, you are needed in your study. Your men are here to help you distribute the, cargo. His eyes slid towards Tenten questioningly, his voice petering out, unsure if she knew the details. It is fine, Guy. She knows about the medicine. Are you going to distribute the medicine? Tenten asked, turning back to look at Neji. Can I come along and help? How exciting would it be to take part in such a noble endeavor? And it would be a good way for her to get to know the town and its people. No, Tenten's eyes widened in shock at the forceful sound of his voice. He softened his tone and reiterated, No, you will stay here. He bowed at the waist. My apologies, Lady Tenten, but we will have to end our stroll here. He offered her an arm. I shall escort you back to the house, then we must part ways. Tenten forced a smile and took his arm, hiding her disappointment. She dearly wanted to help, and it would be a good way for her to get to know this town of his that he cared for so much. She thought that Neji trusted her by now, but perhaps she had been wrong. Already the day was dragging on, and it was only noon. Neji and his men had started distributing the medicine that morning, with most of them doing the work in pairs for safety. Most of the people were grateful for the men's help, of course, but Neji had soon realized that some of the more desperate people would try and take more than their allotted share. So Neji directed his crew to go in pairs so that they can keep each other safe. Neji, though, went alone as he always did. He had always found it difficult to interact with people, a trait not becoming of an earl. But he did his best to visit the people personally. Neji knew it was silly, but he felt more pressure when one of his crewmates went with him, so he preferred going alone when giving medicine or coin to the needy. He was making good time with his deliveries, knowing he could not stay too long at each home, even if some of the people did want to chat with him. It would take him and his men a few days to distribute the medicine to the whole town, and Neji wanted to speed the process along as much as possible. The sooner he was finished with this task, the sooner he could spend more time in Tenten's presence. The next house he visited, like most of the houses in town, had seen better days. Since the Duke had come to town, the people had not been able to make the needed repairs and renovations to their homes, since the little money they had left over from taxes went to food. Neji took care when walking up the few disintegrating steps to the front door. An older lady cracked open the door when he knocked, her face wary. When she realized who was standing before her, a smile appeared on her kind but weathered face and she swung the door wide. My lord, of what do I owe this pleasure? Neji pulled out the medicine allocated to her and smiled at her in return. I have come with the latest medical supplies. Oh, bless your heart, my lord. She clutched the medicine to her chest, her eyes full of gratitude. Thank you. Warmth spread through Neji at her words. Not at being praised, but at knowing he had helped another person to fight another day. The townspeople were slowly losing all hope, and despite the help Neji provided, he knew he would need to do more soon. Medicine and money would not help them for much longer, not with the growing pressure the Duke forced upon them. Is there anything else you need, Chio? Are your larders sufficient? The old lady smiled at him. They will do for now, my lord. Do not worry over me. Neji worried over all his townspeople, but he did not tell her this. A sly look graced Chio's features and she took Neji's hand, startling him. I heard from some of the villagers that there was a lady with you when you arrived in town. Have you finally decided to settle down, my lord? A blush tinted his cheeks, and he knew only Chio could get away with asking an earl such a thing. The lady is merely a guest in my house for a time, Chio. Nothing more. The words felt like ash on his tongue, for Neji was quickly learning that he dearly wanted her to be more, despite telling himself he shouldn't. A shame, the old lady replied with a frown. You deserve to meet a nice woman. You have put us first for too long, my lord. You must care for yourself as well. Neji squeezed her fingers, still holding his, and smiled kindly at her. My townspeople are my priority. He let go of her hand and took a small step back. I must continue with my deliveries. Please contact one of my crew members if you need anything and they will inform me. She waved him off and Neji once again started along the path. There was still a long afternoon ahead of him and he needed to get a move on. However, as he continued from house to house, Neji could not stop thinking back to Chiyo's words. Neji did deserve to find happiness and settle down, and he was convinced he had found the person with whom he wanted to do so with. Sulking was not something Tenten practiced doing, but she couldn't help herself. Neji and his men were out there right now, distributing medicine to the people in need, and Tenten was not allowed to help. Instead, she was reclining in the sitting room, with nothing but boredom to keep her company. Sakura had come in earlier to leave her a tray of tea and scones, but Tenten wasn't hungry. This was something she had disliked when living with her father. How mundane each day was. While the men were able to go out and hunt or do whatever duties they needed to, the women were expected to remain inside, docile and out of the way. Tenten had never been interested in needle pointing or learning the piano, and the only thing she had back home to occupy her time, when she wasn't trying to sneak out of the house to go downtown, was riding her horse. She wasn't sure if she was allowed a lend of one of the horses here though, so she didn't ask. Just when Tenten was about to stand, ready to leave the quiet room behind to explore the house, the door opened, and Hinata and Konohamaru walked in. The young boy looked cleaner than Tenten had ever seen him and there was a lightness to his steps that hadn't been there on the ship. She supposed, though, that he was able to be a boy here, whereas on the Crimson Knight he was part of a crew, where the potential for danger was always present. Konohamaru smiled brightly when he saw Tenten and run up to stand in front of her. We was looking for ye, miss. Tenten smiled at him, glad they were here. Perhaps they could distract her for a while. Were you? Did you need me for something? Lady Hinata wanted to know if her comfortable. Hinata nodded, a shy smile on her lips. She took the seat opposite Tenten and Konohamaru hesitated until she indicated for him to sit too. I wanted to make sure you slept well last night, and to ask if you needed anything during your stay here, she said, her voice soft and kind. I would not be surprised if my cousin was too distracted to ask you himself. Tenten didn't know what Hinata meant by Neji being distracted, but the small, private smile Hinata sent her made her blush. I slept well, thank you, she replied, opting not to comment on the rest of the lady's words. And I am not wanting for anything, except perhaps a couple outfits of my own. Not that I am not grateful for the lend of yours, she added quickly, lest she offend the lady, but I do not want to burden you. It is no burden, I assure you. But I understand as well, it will help make you feel more at home if you have your own clothes. I will inform the tailor to come and take your measurements tomorrow. Thank you. Tenten frowned, remembering her lack of funds. Actually, maybe I should just continue to impose on you, after all. I have no money to pay for any dresses right now. She blushed in embarrassment at the declaration. When had she ever had to worry about money? Do not worry about the cost. My cousin will be happy to spend whatever is needed for your comfort. The way Hinata said it, a secret smile on her lips, made Tenten flush again. Tenten could feel Konohamaru fidgeting beside her, where he had decided to sit. She glanced down at him, wanting a distraction, and noticed his eyes glued to the tray of scones. She smiled in amusement at the blatant look of longing on his face. Would you like a scone, Konohamaru? She asked, grabbing the tray to bring it close to him. Can I? His large eyes shot to hers before glancing at Hinata. He reached out to take one but hesitated, waiting for the lady's confirmation. Of course you may, Hinata said with a nod. He practically pounced on the food, stuffing a whole scone into his mouth without etiquette. Instead of being appalled by his lack of manners, the two women laughed, and Tenten petted his back soothingly when he started coughing. Have some tea, she told him. She held out the now lukewarm tea and he took it with both hands, taking a large sip. Maybe slow down with your next one, okay? Konohamaru looked as though Christmas had come early, so excited he was for more sweets. After eating another scone, this time a little more delicately, he smiled sheepishly up at Tenten. I don't usually stay here, so I'm not used to eating this food, he admitted. Oh, that was a surprise for Tenten. She had thought this would be his home now, after Naruto took him in. Konohamaru usually stays with Lee, Hinata explained since Konohamaru's mouth was full of another scone. We offered to have him stay here, with us, but Konohamaru was worried the townspeople wouldn't look too kindly of an orphan living with an earl. Tenten hated to think the people would have a problem with it. Naruto had saved him from an early death and Neji had offered him a place in their home. The people should be supportive, not angry. But perhaps Konohamaru was aware of the tension simmering in town with the Duke, even at such a young age, and he didn't want to contribute to it. If so, he was smarter than Tenten had given him credit for. What made you change your mind this time, Konohamaru? Tenten asked him. Cap'n wanted me to stay, said I could look after Yi while he's busy. Tenten wasn't used to being embarrassed so often in such a short span of time, and she inwardly cursed when she felt her face heating once again. Each time she heard Neji's acts of kindness, both for her and others, her heart would swell with affection for him. Hinata, obviously sensing Tenten's sudden discomfort, changed the topic. How about you and I give Lady Tenten a proper tour, Konohamaru? I am sure she would like to see the rest of our home. Aye, Lady Hinata. He hesitated upon seeing one more scone left on Tenten's plate. But could we do it after I finish this? The two women laughed again and Konohamaru flushed under the attention. Tenten was glad for their efforts to make her feel comfortable, and she was looking forward to spending the afternoon with them, exploring this large home together. The din echoed through the tavern as Neji took a draught of his ale, scanning the room for any signs of trouble. He wore his pirate outfit, sword at hip, just in case. One never knew what would happen when men got drunk, and he wanted to be prepared in case a brawl broke out. Neji had decided to take his men out for the evening as a thank you for their hard work over the past few days. They had done the work without grumbling, and after almost 4 days the medicine had finally been given to all the townspeople in need. The leftovers, few though they were given to the local healer, and Neji knew she would use the medicine wisely. They had to be discreet with their task, since there were spies all around town, ready to report any signs of dissent to the Duke. Neji refused to let that old man have any knowledge of what they were doing for the people he was supposed to be taking care of. Neji knew of the people who sympathized with the Duke, and he had directed his men to stay clear of their homes. A shame, since Neji wanted all in his town to be cared for, but he did not want to risk the Duke's retaliation if he were to find out. It was easy to wonder, though, if the Duke already had knowledge of what Neji was doing and was just waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Neji shook his head at the disturbing thought. There was no point in worrying about scenarios that may not even happen, not when there were plenty of pleasant things to think about instead. His mind turned to Tenten, as it often did without his meaning to. He knew she had been upset that he had not allowed her to help with the distribution, but Neji had wanted to make sure she stayed at home, where she would be safe. If she had come along, his mind would have been occupied by her, and he would have been distracted from the task needed of him. Distributing the medicine had kept Neji busy, so busy he had not had the time to enjoy his guest's company. He promised himself he would make up for that now his business was concluded, but he was not entirely certain how. Perhaps he could invite her out for the day and show her more of his property. There was a beautiful white oak tree atop a hill at the end of his property that Neji was sure she would like. They could pack a picnic, take the horses, and make a day out of it. The thought of spending a whole day with Tenten thrilled him, even knowing how it would look to the staff. But Neji realized that he no longer cared what his subordinates thought, he just wanted to spend as much time with Tenten as possible. He supposed he could invite Hinata and Naruto along as well, but he dismissed the thought immediately. Hinata would be pleasant company to him, but he already knew what sort of wild antics his cousin-in-law would get into. Neji wanted them to have an enjoyable day together, and he knew he would not enjoy the time with her nearly as much if others were involved. Before he could invite her out, he would have to apologize for tonight, as well as the past few days. Not only had not allowed her to help, but he had also abandoned her in a large, unfamiliar house with people she barely knew. And then, when Tenten wanted to come along to see his crew this evening, having not been able to leave his estate yet, he denied her that too. He was worried for her safety and had made her stay at home, though she had not liked that answer one bit. A smile touched his lips as he remembered the fiery look that had entered her eyes at being told no. He felt bad, he truly did, but with so many men in the tavern, Neji would have had a hard time making sure she went unnoticed, for Neji did not like the thought of other men noticing her, especially drunk ones such as those surrounding him. He loved his town, but even he had to admit that men could be horrible creatures, and Tenten had suffered enough from cruel men in her life. Captain, the sound of Shikamaru's voice shook Neji out of his thoughts, and he turned towards his sailing master. What is it? The younger man leaned forward and lowered his voice, a look of concern on his face. That man over there, he whispered, pointing at an older gentleman looking out of place in his finery as he tried to converse with the locals. I could be wrong, but I think he is asking about your female guest. What? Neji's head swiveled to take in the man, his heart hammering in his chest at the news. Someone was looking for Tenten. But who knew she was in the village, and why would they care? He watched as the man made his way through the tavern, straining his ears to hear bits of conversation that could solidify Shikamaru's worry. The man stepped closer to the group of pirates, talking to two men a couple tables down from them, allowing Neji to pick up snippets of conversation. She's about this tall and has dark brown hair. She would have recently come to town by ship. Neji became increasingly agitated as he heard the man speak, and it was only when he felt Shikamaru touch his arm did he realize he had his hand on his sword, ready to fight. Neji took a deep breath to calm himself, but he could feel his blood simmering. I am offering a reward to anyone who locates her. I promise it will be worth your while. Neji was out of his chair, sword in hand in less than a second. Shikamaru jumped up and stepped in front of him, arms held up in a placating manner. Captain, if you act in such a manner, he will realize you know her. Calm down. His sailing master's words were sound, but Neji could not calm himself. How dare this stranger come into his town and search for Tenten? She was under his protection and Neji would not tolerate anyone with evil intentions towards her. A reward? Those words alone had Neji on edge, for who would offer an award for someone whom they had innocent plans? Neji felt his fist tighten against his ale tankard, his eyes promising death to the mysterious man. You need to keep a level head, Captain. Sit back down. He reluctantly complied, taking a big swig of his ale after he was seated. His glare never left the stranger, though, and he watched as the man spoke to a few more people before finally leaving the establishment. Neji released the breath he had not realized he was holding, his mind once again turning to his chocolate-eyed guest. Neji was especially glad he had forbidden her from joining him and his men this evening. Heaven only knew what Neji would have done if the stranger had recognized her. He would have to keep an extra special eye on Tenten from now on. The man was insufferable, incorrigible. How dare he forbid her from going into town for the evening? And after he had told her that she could, so long as she had a chaperone. What better chaperone than a ship full of pirates? He was trying to renege on his promise. Well, she would see about that. I don't think this is a good idea, my lady, Sakura said. I told you to call me Tenten, and I don't care. I want to go say hello to the captain's crew. I'm an independent woman. He can't stop me from doing what I wish to do. Tenten turned to show the pink-haired maid her outfit. How'd I look? Like a woman trying to pass as a man. Tenten rolled her eyes and turned back to the mirror. She was wearing a dark tunic and pants, found by Sakura after Tenten requested it. Forced her, really. She threw the large cloak over her shoulders, allowing it to mask her feminine curves. She would hide her face within the hood outside, but for now she let it hang around her shoulders. Well, I think it's convincing. Tenten declared. She would not be deterred, no matter what. Tell me again the name of the tavern I'll find them at. Sakura hesitated, her hands wringing in front of her. Are you sure you want to do this? Lord Neji will be very displeased. I do not care if it upsets him. I'm going. She gave Sakura a hard stare, daring the maid to defy her. The name now, if you please. Sakura complied, though she wasn't happy about it. After telling her the name of the tavern, she muttered, I am going to get into so much trouble for this. Tenten sent her a reassuring smile. Don't worry, I won't let you get in trouble. For the first time since they had met, Sakura sent her a frustrated glare, surprising Tenten. I don't think you will be able to stop the Lord's ire. Stepping closer to the irritated maid, Tenten took a hold of both her hands. I promise I will take the fall for this. I am most grateful for your help, Sakura, and I won't let you take any of the blame. If I am caught, that is. Tenten withdrew her hands and gave the maid a little twirl. You really outdid yourself with this getup, Sakura. I am sure no one will be the wiser. With the help of the still irritated maid, Tenten managed to sneak out of the house, and she started down the path Sakura had promised would lead her straight to the tavern. It was dark, the moon almost non-existent, and Tenten pulled her hood closer to her face, a nervous tremor coursing through her now she was on the road. Few people passed her, but Tenten remained cautious, the sword Neji had given to her on the ship strapped to her side under the cloak. She hurried along, determined to arrive at the tavern as soon as possible. It wasn't as though she was undeterred, but she also didn't want to be out in the dark by herself for longer than necessary. Especially with Neji's warnings about the town being dangerous ringing in her head. Tenten hurried along, finally reaching the township where lamps dotted the streets, helping to light the roadway. A man walked past her, and she had to do a double take, her heart picking up speed when she thought she recognized him. But with her hood pulled low over her face and the shadows crossing his features, it was possible she was just seeing things. The man had looked like Danzo, her father's advisor, but why on earth would he be in Kirigakure? No, she told herself as she tried to calm her racing heart, she must have imagined it. The man was obviously someone that looked similar, that was all. Shaking her head to rid herself of the unpleasant thoughts, because anyone connected to her father brought back a wealth of unpleasant memories, she found her way to the tavern Sakura had told her about. Neji and his men were inside, sharing a congratulatory drink after their hard work these past few days. Tenten buzzed with excitement to see the men again, and she was surprised to realize how much she had missed them in just a short time. Even though she had not had a lot to do with them, just seeing them aboard the Crimson Knight each day had become a comfort to her, and she missed it. With a deep breath, Tenten once more fixed her hood, making sure her face was well hidden, before pushing through the tavern doors. At the first glimpse of his disobedient guest, Neji felt his anger rise to unprecedented proportions. He could wring her lovely neck for disregarding his command and coming here, especially now that he knew someone was searching for her. Did she have no sense of self-preservation or common sense? It was almost amusing how hard she had tried to conceal her identity, but there was no way he would not have able to notice her. She had tried to hide herself within the fabric of the large cloak and breeches, but Neji had always been able to see straight through her, even from the beginning, and he was not fooled for a moment. And if he noticed, it would not take long for other men within the tavern to notice as well. Even if they did not connect who she was right away, she was still a single woman by herself surrounded by a room full of intoxicated men, and he could throttle her for that alone. Neji stood up, ready to drag her out of the establishment and back home, when he noticed two men at a table nearby glancing in her direction, their heads bent together as they whispered. Alarm bells rang in his mind at the way they were eyeing her, and Neji quickly reached her side, his hand latching onto her arm tightly. The infuriating woman gasped at his sudden presence, her chocolate eyes widening in surprise. "Captain?" He ignored the way her breath came out in a breathy whisper and glared at her. "I thought I told you to stay at home," he said, voice low. She had the nerve to hitch her chin higher, a defiant glint sparkling in her chocolate brown eyes. "You are not the boss of me, my lord. I wanted to see the men. Besides, I donned a disguise, so it will be fine." Neji wanted to groan at the ridiculousness of her words. That outfit would not fool even the simplest of males, he growled. "Men are already noticing your presence, and you have barely been here 5 minutes. Tenten glanced around, no doubt inspecting the men around them to make sure he spoke the truth, and he felt her step closer to him when her eyes met the tavern patron's. "I thought it would work." Her voice was soft, and despite his anger, Neji felt the sudden desire to circle his arms around her and promise that she was safe with him. A scuffle sounded behind him and Neji turned to see the two men standing with fingers pointed in their direction. Shikamaru and Kiba were in front of them, keeping the men from moving towards Neji and his guest. "That's her," one of them yelled, eyes trained on the woman beside him. Neji moved to block their view of her, but already the damage was done. Others in the tavern were beginning to stare at her, their whispers growing louder by the moment. "What's happening?" Tenten asked. She reached her free hand to clutch at his shirt, and Neji felt his heart soar at the gesture despite the situation. She was looking to him for protection, and he would not let her down. Neji sent her a brief glare before turning back to face the men. "You should have stayed home." "But there are other women here." "Not many," she added reluctantly, and Neji could only imagine her head whipping back and forth as she looked for female companions. "But I can see some. What's so special about me?" Oh, she had no idea how special she was, and Neji was not thinking about the reward money or the man searching for her. After only a few weeks, Tenten had managed to weasel her way into Neji's heart, and though he had tried to resist her in the beginning, he could not dislodge her. Neji's feelings for this hot-headed woman continued to grow with each passing day. Which was why it was even more important that they leave the tavern immediately. Neji trusted his men to handle things here, but he had to make sure Tenten was safe, and that meant being as far from here as possible. "Come," he told her, releasing her arm to grab her hand as he tugged her behind him out the door. "But I haven't even said hello to anyone yet. Do not argue, Tenten." He rounded on her, eyes hard, and saw her flinch at the venom in his voice. Neji could not help it. Her safety was in danger and it terrified him. People would do anything for money, and Neji refused to let them anywhere near her. He continued down the path at a brisk pace, ignoring Tenten as she struggled to free her hand from his. A shout from behind them had him looking back, only to see the two men from earlier rushing through the tavern doors after them. Neji swore and started to run, pulling her along with him. "Why are they chasing us?" Tenten asked as Neji led her through the buildings, trying to lose their pursuers. "It seems someone is looking for you," Neji replied, his voice still tight with anger. He was mad at her, yes, but he was furious at the people who thought they could take her from him. "What?" She sounded breathless, but it was still too early to stop running. "Why would someone be looking for me?" Oh, she stumbled and Neji grunted as he pulled her up and continued running. I thought I saw someone I recognized earlier, but I didn't think it was possible. If she knew the man looking for her, then it could only be one of her father's lackeys. His heart squeezed at the thought that such a violent man was searching for Tenten, and Neji vowed not to hand her over to him. He would die before he let her be taken. Through here. Neji was starting to tire, and he pulled Tenten into the next alley he came across. Hiding amongst the shadows, Neji pushed her against the wall and shielded her with his body, blocking her view from the street. It was a good thing she had worn a dark cloak, since it would make them less likely to be spotted. But if they were, he was ready. Neji brushed his hand against the hilt of his sword, preparing himself for a potential fight. He would prefer to avoid bloodshed, but he would do what he must to protect Tenten. It did not take long for Neji to hear footsteps running along the cobblestone road, and he breathed a sigh of relief when they passed by their hiding spot. Still, he did not step away from Tenten for long minutes, wanting to make sure their followers were truly gone before venturing back onto the streets. It was only when she began to squirm against him that he realized he was still holding her hand, his other arm resting against the small of her back, keeping her chest pressed to his. He felt her heart beating wildly against him, and he would be surprised if she could not feel his doing the same. Neji tilted his head to look at her, and their gazes locked together, their faces so close together that their breath mingled in the air between them. Her eyes drew him in and refused to relinquish their hold on him. She was so beautiful, staring up at him from the darkness of the alley, almost ethereal, and Neji wished this moment between them could last forever. A cat howled in the distance, startling Tenten, and she broke away from his gaze. Captain?" Neji could see her cheeks turn pink, even in the darkness. "Captain, I think they're gone." He said nothing, just continued to watch her, and she started to fidget under his gaze. "Sorry, it's Lord now, isn't it? I still can't get used to that." "Neji," Tenten tilted her head, confused. "What? I would like you to call me Neji." He watched as her eyes widened at his words, her face tilting up to try and see him better in the darkness. But that wouldn't be proper, my lord." Neji was sick and tired of being proper, of keeping his distance for fear of what his crew or family might think. He liked Tenten far more than he initially thought possible, and he wanted to pursue these feelings with her. To hell with propriety. Pulling her close so she was flush against him, Neji leaned down and kissed her. Tenten's startled gasp warmed his mouth, but he did not take the opportunity to deepen the kiss, content as he was to feel her lips on his. She remained rigid in his arms, and Neji began to panic, wondering if he had gotten his wires crossed. What if she did not fancy him, and here he was accosting her in a darkened alley? Just when he was about to let go of her, her arms trailed up his back to wind around his neck, and Neji felt her soften against him. She sighed into the kiss, and this time Neji could not help taking the opportunity to deepen it. He released her lips, pulling back just enough to lean his forehead against hers. "I am still mad at you," he declared softly. "You should never have come out here by yourself." It was amusing how she still managed to glare at him despite the dark tint to her cheeks. "I would not have been by myself if you had let me come in the first place. It was not safe. There is a person searching for you, Tenten." Neji did not want to argue with her, but he would not compromise when it came to her safety, not ever. "You didn't know about that at the time, so don't even try to play that card." "Stubborn woman," he growled. "Must you always get the last word in?" Tenten set her chin a notch higher, causing their noses to brush together. "Yes, I must. Now stop arguing and kiss me some more." A smile touched his lips at her bold words, and he removed one hand from her hip to hold the side of her face. Leaning in so that there was barely a breath between them, he murmured, with pleasure, before capturing her lips once more. Over the next few days, Neji made an extra effort to spend more and more time with Tenten, much to her surprise. She had thought their kiss might have just been a spur-of-the-moment thing for him, the adrenaline from the bar chase having overwhelmed his senses momentarily, but Neji was proving her wrong. The two of them began spending more time together in his gardens, where they could have some semblance of privacy from the people of his employ, and he also adjusted his schedule so he could eat his meals with her. It was all very flattering and sweet, and Tenten found herself looking forward to every moment of theirs together. During dinner of the third day after what Tenten dubbed the kiss, Neji, who was seated beside her and who had been eating quietly for most of the meal, leaned over and asked, "Are you busy tomorrow?" She wasn't, of course. There was not much she could do when she couldn't go to town, and she worried poor Sakura was getting sick of her. Konohamaru always seemed happy to spend time with Tenten, and for that she was grateful, but there was only so much one could talk about with a boy so young. Hinata was lovely, and Tenten enjoyed their time together immensely, but she had not yet organized to spend part of the day with her. Tenten longed to visit town, to actually go and do something that did not include these four walls, but she understood why she could not. Since learning someone was looking for her, Neji had forbade her from leaving his estate. She did not like being confined in such a way, but she also knew it was the safest option. If Danzo was truly searching for her, the best place she could be was here, where she had Neji's protection. Other than spending some time in the library, I had no plans, she replied, glancing in his direction. Good. Neji nodded, pleased. We will be going out. Out? As in, to town? Neji shot her a look of annoyance. No? She knew it, of course, but a part of her wanted to tease him. She didn't know why, but she enjoyed it when Neji became exasperated with her. Where are we going, then, if not into town? Tenten rarely saw Neji looking uncomfortable, but he was so now, shifting in his seat and glancing around the room before finally resting his gaze on her again. You will find out tomorrow. A surprise outing? This isn't a date, is it? Tenten asked in a teasing voice, but her heart quickened at the thought. Neji flushed at her words, once again breaking eye contact. Tenten had been half joking, but his reaction caused heat to infuse her cheeks. It was a date, after all. Clearing his throat, he stood up abruptly, eyes still not meeting hers. I have business to attend to in my office, he told her, finally meeting her gaze. I will see you tomorrow at breakfast. Without giving Tenten time to reply, Neji turned and fled the room. Neji paced his office, willing his heart to slow and his cheeks to cool down. He had not expected to feel embarrassed when he asked her out for the day, had not expected her to realize the day for what it was, and so had become flustered when she figured out his plan. That plan, despite his embarrassment, was something he had been looking forward to for days now. The cook had everything organized for the morrow, and his stable hands would have the horses prepared by the time Neji and Tenten were ready to leave. Nervous excitement, the kind he usually felt just before a battle at sea, thrummed through Neji's body, and once again his heart started to race at the thought of their day tomorrow. Would Tenten like what he had planned for them? So far, because of his schedule, they had only been able to spend short amounts of time together. But Neji made sure to clear the whole day tomorrow so he could spend it with her, which would give him a chance to really get to know her. Neji wanted to learn everything he could about his beautiful, fascinating woman. And if he were able to steal another kiss or two from her during their date, well, that would be a bonus. With that thought swirling in his head, Neji sat himself down at his desk. He had a lot of work to do before their date, and he wanted nothing to encroach on his time with his beautiful, chocolate-eyed guest. The stable smelled of horses and manure, a combination Tenten had grown to love as a young child. She wore one of Hinata's riding habits, a matching navy shirt and jacket, a long skirt reaching her ankles, and a pair of knee-length boots. The outfit didn't fit her perfectly, since Tenten did not have the same curves as Hinata, but it would have to do. The tailor was still working on her dresses, and she wondered if it was too late to request a riding habit as well. She stood to the side, watching as the stable hand led what was to be her horse to the paddock. Honey was a beautiful Palomino mare, and she looked regal and beautiful as she walked behind the man. Tenten was in love with her already, and as she held out her hand for the mare to sniff, she knew they would be good friends. Are you ready? Neji asked, walking up beside her. His riding waistcoat was tucked into a pair of full-length tan breeches, and his long hair was neatly arranged so it was away from his face. Yes. Tenten nodded as she spoke, a smile lighting her face. She wasn't entirely sure what his plan was for the day, but she liked where it was headed. He led her to where Honey stood, and before she could understand what was happening, Neji grabbed her by the waist and lifted her onto the mare. She flushed furiously at the touch of his hands on her body, not used to such contact. From her perch atop her horse, she asked, "Where are we going today?" She squirmed uncomfortably at being sat side saddle. Back home, she wore breeches instead of a skirt when riding, which allowed her to sit more comfortably on the horse. It wasn't proper behavior for a lady, but Tenten didn't care. She had few reprieves from her father, and riding was one of them. She wanted to enjoy it without the hindering layers of a dress. Neji shook his head, a small smile touching his lips. You will know when we arrive. Tenten rolled her eyes, unable to help herself even though she knew such an action was inappropriate and disrespectful when aimed at an earl. Somehow, though, she didn't think he would mind. You and your secrets. Okay, you win. I won't ask again. As she waited for Neji to mount his own horse, a beautiful black stallion, Tenten petted Honey's neck, murmuring encouraging words in the mare's ear. Tenten wasn't too proud to admit to herself that she was nervous. It had been a long time since she had been on a horse, and she told Honey so. The mare seemed to listen to her concerns, and Tenten felt herself begin to relax the more she petted the mare's neck. Once Neji was seated, the stable hand opened the gate to let them through and Honey immediately followed Neji's lead, ears tilting forward with excitement. "Lead the way, my lord," Tenten said as they led their steeds into the fields beyond the paddock. Neji turned to her, his eyebrow raised and lips pulled down in a frown. She knew exactly what he wanted, but she was embarrassed to say it, especially with the stable hand close by. He paused, though, pulling the reins on his horse so it stilled, and turned in his seat to face her fully. When Honey stopped automatically, so close that Tenten's legs brushed against Neji's, she became nervous. "Neji," she murmured, feeling her cheeks heating under his intense gaze. "Lead the way, Neji." His eyes twinkled with mirth and a triumphant smirk touched his lips. "With pleasure, Tenten." The couple trotted along side by side, Honey following Neji's stallion at a leisurely pace. The views of his land were breathtaking, with wide rolling hills as far as the eye could see. Tenten was in awe. The more they rode, the more Tenten could see herself enjoying this scenery every day, of exploring his lands, and spending this sort of quality time with Neji on a regular basis. But she would be leaving shortly, as soon as Neji was ready to depart once more. There was no use in daydreaming of a life that would not be hers, and Tenten tried to rein in her wayward thoughts. After a half hour of riding, they crested a hill. Neji pulled up his horse and Tenten followed suit, her eyes widening as she stared at the next hill over. On top of the grassy peak sat a single tree, with its branches reaching long and high in the air, creating a beautiful shady spot one could happily spend their day under. She glanced at Neji and found him already watching her, a smile playing on his lips. "Is it to your liking, Tenten?" This was the surprise, she asked. He nodded, eyes still on her, and Tenten thought she detected a hint of color on his cheeks. "I thought we could have a picnic." Tenten's mind flashed back to when she was a young child. One of her earliest memories was also one of her last memories of her mother. The two of them had gone on a picnic, Tenten having ridden on her mother's horse in front of her, the older woman's arm wrapped protectively around her small frame. They had traveled much like this, to a spot that had been her mother's favorite. Once there, the two of them unfurled the picnic rug, arranged the food, and stayed for the whole day. Tenten's mother had been a gentle soul, kind, well-spoken, generous, and Tenten had cherished that day dearly for many years. Then, 2 weeks later, her mother had gotten ill, and no manner of doctors could help her. Tenten's father had blamed her, a child of barely 5 years old, for his wife's death. If only she hadn't gone out that day, she wouldn't have caught ill. Because of his words, Tenten had blamed herself for a long time, though she had since gotten past that guilt. It had not been her fault, nor had it been her mother's. It was a terrible occurrence, but no one had been at fault. "Tenten?" She glanced up to see Neji watching her, a worried expression on his face. She pushed away the sudden thoughts of her mother. It had been a long time since Tenten had allowed herself to think of her. Along with a sudden rush of tears and sent Neji a wide smile. "A picnic sounds perfect. Thank you, Neji." Neji watched her for a moment longer, but when she made no attempt to tell him what was on her mind, he dismounted his horse. Coming over to where she still sat on Honey, he placed his arms on his hips and helped her down, and Tenten had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from blushing. He left her to stand beside the mare as he unwrapped a picnic basket and rug from his saddle. Tenten watched as he laid the rug under the tree and began unpacking the food, her stomach rumbling at the contents he drew out. Freshly baked bread, cheeses, fruits, and a bottle of sweet wine were carefully pulled out of the basket and arranged on the rug, Neji taking his time to make sure it was presented nicely. After he was done, Neji glanced up at her from his position on the rug and held out a hand. "Come, Tenten." He looked so wonderful, sitting there with his arm outstretched for her, his lovely pale eyes intent on hers. Tenten felt another rush of nerves overtake her and she realized that she was alone with him for the first time. There was no one watching them from the windows, nor was there anyone just outside the doors to her cabin. They were miles away from another living soul. Tenten knew Neji was a gentleman and that nothing would happen, but she was also surprised he had not invited others to share the day with him. Did he not care what his family or staff thought? Surely, he must know what they would say upon learning about this unchaperoned trip of theirs. Not wanting to ruin this beautiful day Neji had organized for her, Tenten walked over to him and placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her as she sat beside him. She arranged her skirts around herself, needing something to do while she tried to rein in her errant heart. Once she was settled, Neji piled some food onto one of the plates and handed it to her with a glass of sweet wine. Tenten took the food and drank gratefully, her emotions once again getting the better of her. No one had ever done anything like this for her before, not since her mother had passed, and the gesture was leaving her without words. She forced herself to look Neji in the eye, despite her heated cheeks and pounding heart, and said, "This is beautiful, Neji. Truly. Thank you so much for bringing me here today." Neji could easily get used to hearing his name come from those lips. The first time Tenten had said it, she had sounded shy, but this time it came out easily, as though she called him by his name often. He was glad Tenten seemed to like his surprise. This had been his favorite spot to relax ever since he was a boy, and he wanted to share it with Tenten before they sailed. He had told both his cousin and her husband of his plans, and Naruto had tried to weasel his way on the date, saying he and Hinata could come along as chaperones, but Neji had been firm. The day was to be just for the two of them. The blonde would be scrubbing the deck for the next month if Neji even caught a glimpse of him anywhere near them. The cook had outdone herself with the food, simple though it was, and Neji would have to remind himself to thank her for her efforts. She had been overjoyed when Neji told her about his plans for Tenten, and the matronly woman had pestered him with questions until he could politely excuse himself and escape. It was one thing to know he had feelings for Tenten and decide to pursue them, but quite another when his staff began asking when they were to be wed. The question excited him as much as it terrified him, and he knew neither of them were ready for such a conversation, not yet. Neji assembled a plate for himself, watching his guest subtly as she picked at her food. He could tell she was nervous. She was not the only one, and he wanted to ease her nerves so she could relax and be herself with him. "You rode well today," he said by way of conversation. "Did you have a horse back home?" Tenten gave him a small smile. "Yes. I used Thundercloud to escape my father when he became too irate to be around. At times, I wouldn't even have time to saddle him, so I would ride bareback through the paddocks until I felt I could breathe again." Neji loathed hearing about her father and his cruelty, but he was glad Tenten felt comfortable enough to open up to him. "I would like to give honey to you." He did not want her to feel confined to the house, and if she got some relief in riding, then he would gladly give her all the horses she desired. "You mean, during my stay here?" she asked, a strange look on her face. How could Neji have forgotten Tenten was leaving? She was only staying with him temporarily while he remained on the island, then he would be finding her a more appropriate town to settle down in. But for a moment, Neji had let himself believe she was staying, that she would remain his guest long-term and, when the time was right, would even become the mistress of his estate. He kept his disappointment to himself and nodded. "Of course. She is yours anytime you wish to ride her during your stay. I shall inform the staff to give you full access to her whenever you want." Tenten thanked him with a bright smile, but Neji thought he caught a glimmer of disappointment in her eyes. This was supposed to be an enjoyable picnic. Neji shook off the lingering sadness clinging to him and decided to focus on happy topics. He wanted her to enjoy her time with him, limited though it was. He did not want her to be distracted by unhappy thoughts. "What kind of child were you, Tenten?" he asked by way of distraction. He suspected she had been a mischievous child, and when a smirk touched her lips at his question, he knew he was correct in his assumption. Despite the somewhat awkward start to the date, it had turned into a very pleasant day. After a couple glasses of wine, Tenten had loosened up and she felt comfortable speaking about different topics. She told him about her daring escapes as a child, of how she would sneak off to town whenever she could, having a friend among the townspeople she played with. Neji told her of his childhood too, and as she had suspected, he had been the model child, never getting into mischief unless provoked into it. Tenten couldn't imagine being such a well-behaved daughter, but she supposed she may have been had her mother not died. The topic changed from their differing childhoods to sports. Tenten discovered that Neji had learned fencing and shooting at a young age, which had helped him adapt to life as a pirate quite easily. Tenten had not had such privilege, but she told Neji that she would often watch her father's guards spar in their home's training room, and when she was caught doing that, she began watching street fighters in town, where they used an abandoned building by the docks to train. Neji had not been shocked upon learning about her array of unladylike behaviors throughout the years, nor had he seemed put out about it. That alone was enough to make Tenten's heart flutter, but he managed to affect her in other ways too. Neji was attentive to her every word as well as to how much she ate and drank, and he offered her his jacket when the weather turned cool. Tenten had assumed they would stay out a couple hours at the most before heading back to his estate, but when he stretched out on the rug after packing away the leftover food, she realized he had planned to stay a while. After coaxing her to lay next to him, her face had heated considerably when he asked her. The couple spoke some more until Tenten felt herself dozing off. It was late afternoon when she stirred, and she found Neji readying to head back, tying the picnic basket to his horse's saddle. She was still on the rug, Neji's jacket placed over her to keep the breeze at bay. Tenten sat up and Neji's head turned in her direction at the sound, his lips tipping up in a soft smile. Good afternoon, Tenten. I'm sorry. You should have woken me sooner. I didn't mean to fall asleep. Do not apologize. Neji strolled over to her and held out his arm. She placed her hand in his and he helped her stand. I fell asleep not long after you. I must admit, I do not often get the chance to have an afternoon nap. It was quite relaxing. He was still holding her hand, and they were standing very close to one another, Neji having not stepped back once he helped her up. Tenten flushed at their proximity, but it didn't make her uncomfortable. On the contrary, Tenten found she very much enjoyed having him so close to her. She felt protected, safe. More than that, though, she felt wanted. Neji was the first person in years to make her feel wanted, and Tenten didn't want that feeling to end. Just when she thought he might lean in to kiss her, though, Neji stepped back and released her hand. He stooped to pick up the picnic rug, then folded it and tied it to his horse. Afterwards, he took Honey's reins and brought her to where Tenten stood. Are you ready to head back? He asked, his voice soft. Tenten nodded, unwilling to use her voice. She still felt groggy from waking up, and she worried she would say something she may regret, like asking him to kiss her. Or asking if she could stay with him forever. Neji seemed amused at her silence. He took her hand again and moved her to stand at Honey's flank, ready to help her onto the horse. Tenten steadied herself, but instead of grabbing her hips to lift her up, Neji surprised her by pressing his lips to hers. He pressed forward, deepening the kiss for a brief moment before pulling back. What was that for? She asked, a little dazed. Neji was smirking, an amused look on his face. You kept looking at my lips. How else should I have taken such an invitation? Tenten felt her face heat up. She hadn't realized she had been staring, but she had been thinking about his lips, so her eyes must have naturally gravitated towards them. A chuckle rumbled from Neji's chest and without warning he lifted her onto her waiting horse. She looked down at him and a quick, barely there grin spread across his features before it disappeared again. Tenten's heart stuttered to a stop at the sight. She had seen him smile and smirk, but she had never seen him grin before, and she immediately wanted to see another one. Her feelings for this man were growing with each passing day, and if she didn't rein them in soon, she didn't know how she would be able to leave him once the time came. As she followed him home, Tenten worried that she was already in over her head. Thanks for watching. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.